There is a chapter of Space Marines that has fought for over 4,000 years, held its honor like a blade pressed to its own chest, defied one of the most powerful organizations in the Imperium, and came within a single breath of total extinction, and most people have never heard of them. They wear gold armor and azure blue helms. They come from a world of jungles and savannas, a culture of hunters and storytellers, where pride is not arrogance, but a way of life. They bear titles like Death Speaker and Lifebinder and War Leader. They are brothers in a way that most Space Marine chapters can only gesture at from a distance. And they were systematically dismantled not by the forces of chaos, not by tyrannid swarms or orc invasions, but by the very institution meant to protect the Imperium they served so faithfully. They were destroyed by the Inquisition, or rather, the Inquisition tried very hard to destroy them. And the fact that they still exist at all is one of the most remarkable stories in the entire 41st millennium. This is the story of the Celestial Lions. Part 1. Born in Gold, Origins of a Chapter. To understand the Celestial Lions, you have to go back. All the way back to the 38th millennium, which is itself deep history by the standards of most people living in the 41st. The galaxy is old, and the Imperium is older still. And somewhere in that great sweep of 10,000 years, following the Horus Heresy, a new chapter was called into being. The exact founding that produced the Celestial Lions is one of those details that Imperial records have either lost or chosen not to preserve clearly. Some scholars in universe believe it may have been the 23rd founding, also called the Sentinel founding, though nothing confirms this with certainty. What is known is that this chapter was raised in the latter years of the 38th millennium, and that they were born from the gene seed of Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists. Now, when we say a chapter carries the gene seed of Rogel Dorn, that matters. It is not merely a biological inheritance, though it is certainly that. It is a spiritual one. Dorn was the great architect, the builder of walls and defender of last stands. He was the Primarch who stood at the gates of the Imperial Palace when everything was falling apart, who told his sons that they would hold even if the galaxy itself cracked around them. That stubbornness, that absolute refusal to yield on a matter of honor or principle, that is Dorn's legacy, and you see it in every chapter that carries his bloodline. The Imperial Fists, the Black Templars, the Crimson Fists, and yes, the Celestial Lions. They are all scions of the same ancient will, and that shared heritage will matter enormously later in this story, when one group of Dorn's sons steps up to save another. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, because the beginning of the Celestial Lions is itself worth dwelling on. They were placed, or perhaps, more accurately, they were assigned to a region of the Ultima Segmentum called Alara's Veil. This is important context, so hold on to it for a moment, and we will return to the Veil shortly with more depth. For now, understand this. The Celestial Lions were given a region of space to watch over, and a world from which to recruit. That world is Elysium 9, and it is a planet unlike almost any other in the Space Marine lore. When you think of the homeworlds that produce Space Marines, certain images come to mind. Death worlds wreathed in toxic atmosphere, and predators that could tear a tank apart. Feudal worlds where knights in iron armor do perpetual battle under red suns. Ice worlds where savage tribes conduct ritual combat in blizzards for the honor of being selected. The usual spread of brutal, punishing environments designed to produce warriors who have already outlasted everything the universe has thrown at them. Elysium 9 is none of those things. Or rather, it is something more specific and more interesting. Before the Great Rift tore the galaxy open in later centuries, Elysium 9 was described as a world defined by abundant jungles and savannas, vast stretching grasslands lit by warm suns, deep green forests teeming with animal life. The kind of world where to survive, you needed not just strength, but craft. The people who lived there were hunters, renowned hunters. Cultures built around the patient pursuit of prey, the reading of tracks and wind, and the behavior of animals, the discipline of the long game rather than the short, brutal charge. And those people, those hunters from the equatorial civilizations of a warm, living world, became the Celestial Lions. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means for a chapter's character. So many Space Marine chapters draw from worlds where life is about endurance, about surviving the killing cold or the lethal beast, or the tribal warfare of a shattered civilization. The Celestial Lions came from something warmer than that, something more communal. Their culture valued not just individual prowess, but the shared wisdom of the pride, a word that carries obvious significance given their name and imagery. Hunters understand that the lions of a savanna do not hunt as lone wolves. They cooperate, they coordinate, they share the work, and they share the kill. They look after their own. This bleeds into everything about how the Celestial Lions operate as a chapter. More than almost any other example in Space Marine lore, the culture of their homeworld carries directly into their identity as warriors. The brothers of the Celestial Lions are described as remarkably informal with one another. A basic battle brother will speak to a superior with the kind of candor and directness that would be considered insubordination in a more rigidly structured chapter. They call each other brother in the way their ancestors called a fellow hunter brother, with genuine warmth, genuine meaning, not as a ceremonial title, but as a statement of lived relationship. There is a bond there that goes beyond duty or genetic inheritance. It goes all the way back to a hot world of tall grass and shared meals around shared fires, where the hunters who returned were celebrated not with ranks and medals, but with stories. Because here is the other remarkable thing about the Celestial Lions and the culture they carry with them into the 41st millennium. They are storytellers. They value the craft of the tale above almost any other art. A Celestial Lion who can narrate a battle with true skill, who can make the listening brothers feel the weight of each moment, who can preserve the meaning of what happened, rather than just the sequence of events, that warrior is honored, in a way that speaks of something very old and very human at the chapter's core. Before every battle, or so the accounts suggest, the chapter's senior officers might share a story. The tradition of the hunt transferred into the ritual of remembrance and meaning. They tell tales so that they remember who they are and why they fight, so that the names of the fallen are not just numbers in an apothecary's gene seed ledger, but voices that still carry weight in the ears of the living. This matters tremendously, not just as cultural color, but as the key to understanding why the Celestial Lions do what they do when the Inquisition comes for them. A chapter of rigid, cold warriors, following the Codex Astartes to the letter, might have processed the events on Qatar as a political inconvenience to be managed. The Celestial Lions could not do that, because to them, silence in the face of an atrocity was not just politically unwise, it was a betrayal of the story. It was letting a terrible thing happen and then allowing it to be forgotten or misremembered. Their entire culture screams against that. You do not let the story be told wrong. You do not let the truth die in silence. Elysium 9 also tells us something about the chapter's physical character. The warriors the Celestial Lions recruit are, broadly, men of dark complexion, born to equatorial climes, bearing the warm brown skin of people who have lived under a close sun for generations. This is a detail that some people encounter with surprise when they first learn about the Celestial Lions, but it is really only surprising if you've never looked past the most visible chapters in the hobby. The 41st millennium is a galaxy of uncountable billions of people across 100,000 worlds, and to expect that all warriors of note would look like men from one particular corner of ancient Earth would be absurd, even by the Imperium's deeply absurd standards. The Celestial Lions are a chapter of warriors who look like they came from somewhere real, somewhere warm and alive, and that specificity of origin makes them feel grounded and human in a way that a lot of Space Marine lore can struggle to achieve. Their armor colors reflect this too, in their own way. Gold, not the dull-aged gold of corrosion and centuries, but a warm, burnished gold that catches light like a lion's coat in afternoon sun. And against that gold, their shoulder plates and helmets are painted in azure blue, the color of a clear sky above a savanna, the color of deep water. It is a striking combination, distinct and immediately recognizable, and it carries the feeling of their origins in a visual language. They look like their world sounds. For the first 4,000 years of their existence, give or take, the Celestial Lions were, by all accounts, a chapter of great honor, fighting across dozens of worlds, building a reputation as disciplined and formidable sons of Dorn. Nothing in the early records suggests they were controversial, or radical, or anything other than loyal servants of the Emperor, doing exactly what a Space Marine chapter is supposed to do. They watched their assigned region of space. They answered calls for aid. They bled for the Imperium and honored their dead and trained their next generation and carried their stories forward. And then came the 25th founding, also called the Bastion founding, sometime in the latter half of the 40th millennium. And with it came the event that would change everything about the chapter's situation and set in motion the chain of consequences that nearly destroyed them. If you are watching from somewhere interesting wherever you are in the world, whatever time of night or day is passing you by, drop it in the comments below. I always love seeing where these stories reach. And if the Celestial Lions are already a chapter you care about, make sure you subscribe, because there is a great deal more of this story left to tell. Part 2. Sentinels of the Veil, Alara's Veil, and the Adeptus Veilari. Alara's Veil. The name alone carries something. It is a massive crimson-colored nebula located in the Ultima Segmentum, one of the 4 great segmenta into which the Imperium divides its territory, and the one that stretches out toward the galactic east. The nebula is named after a legendary figure whose history is genuinely uncertain. The people of the worlds within the Veil worship Alara as a mythological hero. Some say as the Emperor's bride, whose funeral veil became the crimson cloud of stellar gas that now colors their skies with red. Others suggest she may have been an actual Imperial commander or saint from the Great Crusade of the 30th millennium, a historical figure whose deeds were large enough to become mythology. Whoever Alara actually was, the region that carries her name is a relatively isolated part of the 20 human-settled worlds, scattered across a nebula of crimson stellar gases that paint everything in shades of red and amber. It is, by the standards of the Imperium's great hive worlds and forge worlds and shrine worlds, a backwater. This is not a strategically critical sector on the scale of, say, the realm of Ultramar or the fortress worlds of Cadia's defensive network. It is a quiet corner, protected not because it is particularly important in the grand strategic calculations of the High Lords of Terra, but because it is part of the Imperium, and it has people in it, and the Imperium is supposed to protect its people. Supposed to. For thousands of years, the Celestial Lions protected Alara's Veil alone. 20 worlds, a chapter of 1,000 warriors at full strength, and all the threats that came from the outer dark. This is already a punishing assignment. Space Marine chapters are not designed to be garrison forces. They are strike forces, mobile and precise. Asking a single chapter to serve as the permanent defensive shield for an entire sector of space is asking a great deal. The Celestial Lions did it. They bled for those 20 worlds, answered every distress call, marched out against every Xenos raid and heretical uprising, and warp anomaly that threatened the people under their protection. They did this for centuries. Eventually, it became clear that one chapter was not enough. The veil was shifting. New threats were pressing in from outside. The chapter was being stretched thin in ways that left gaps in the protection of worlds they were supposed to defend. A petition was made to the Senatorum Imperialis, the High Lords of Terra, themselves for reinforcement. The request was granted in the way such requests sometimes are in the Imperium. Slowly, bureaucratically, but eventually, genuinely. The 25th founding was called, and from it emerged 2 new chapters assigned specifically to serve alongside the Celestial Lions in the defense of Alara's Veil. The first of these new chapters was the Emperor's Spears. They were settled on a world called Nemeton within the Veil, a storm-racked, turbulent world populated by warlike tribal peoples whose harsh existence made them excellent aspirants. The Emperor's Spears are themselves a fascinating chapter with their own deep lore and their own story of survival and devotion. But for our purposes, they are the Celestial Lions' cousins-in-arms, the allies who will appear at crucial moments in this narrative, and who ultimately help carry the story of the Veil forward when the Lions can no longer do it alone. The second chapter was the Star Scorpions, known in High Gothic as the Androctonus Astra. Their gene seed is of unknown origin. This detail is important, though Imperial records either cannot or will not clarify where their biological inheritance came from. They were settled on a world called Common Sen within the Veil, and they took up their guardian duties alongside the Lions and the Spears. For a time, a brief and precious time in the scale of the 40th millennium, there was something like balance in Alara's Veil. 3 chapters, bound by oath, defending 20 worlds from whatever might threaten them. This arrangement is given a formal name and recognition, the Adeptus Violari, or in the common tongue, the Sentinels of the Veil. Their combined sigil is called the Manticora Bestia Fidelitas in High Gothic, and it represents the unity of three brothers sworn to a single purpose. 3 different chapters, 3 different cultures and homeworlds and traditions, but all of them ultimately committed to the same thing, keeping the people of Alara's Vale alive and within the Emperor's light. Then things began to go wrong for 2 of those 3 chapters, in very different ways. The Star Scorpions were undone by something that feels almost tragic in its randomness. The gene seed of the chapter, that biological heritage on which the whole edifice of the Adeptus Astartes depends, the foundation of recruitment and continuation, was flawed. Deeply, irreparably flawed. The exact nature of the defect is not fully detailed in the records we have access to, but the consequence was stark. The Star Scorpions could not adequately replace their losses. Each generation of aspirants that went through the process of becoming Space Marines suffered a failure rate that would have been considered catastrophic in any other chapter. Warriors who should have emerged as brothers of the chapter instead died in the process, or failed to develop properly, or suffered mutations that made them unfit for service. The chapter was quietly hemorrhaging its own future. And then, to add to this quiet catastrophe, the Star Scorpion's entire fleet became trapped in the warp. A jump gone wrong, a route that became a current in that terrible sea of psychic energy that defies navigation, and the ships carrying the chapter were seized by the Imperium and its inhabitants. The chapter was declared extinct, lost, forgotten in the rolls of the dead chapters that dot the long history of the Adeptus Astartes like headstones. Except, as we will discover much later in this story, they were not entirely gone. The warp had them, yes, but the warp also changed them in the way it changes everything it touches, and what emerged from those depths eventually was something very different from the loyal servants of the Emperor who went in. But that is a revelation for later chapters of this tale. The Emperor's spears survived. They survived and they endure, barbarian watchmen holding their vigil in the outer dark, and they remain one of the most compelling chapters in the contemporary lore of the 41st and 42nd millennia. Their story intersects with the Celestial Lions at moments of real consequence. And the Celestial Lions themselves? They were still standing, 4,000 years of history behind them, their brothers in the Veilari facing extinction and corruption around them, and ahead of them, without their knowledge, the worst crisis of their existence. A crisis that would begin not in Alara's Vale, not against some Xenos threat or warp-born enemy, but on a planet called Qatar in 948, Mega 41, when an inquisitor named Apollyon decided that the best way to end a rebellion was to end the planet. Part 3. Culture of the Lions, Who They Really Are. Before we reach Qatar and the catastrophe it set in motion, it is worth spending real time with who the Celestial Lions actually are as a chapter, because so much of what happens to them only lands with its full emotional weight if you understand what they value, what they believe, and what kind of people they are before the Inquisition begins its long campaign against them. The Celestial Lions are an unusual chapter within the ranks of the Adeptus Astartes, and not just because of their appearance or their homeworld. Their distinctive character runs deep into their structure, their traditions, and even the names they use for their officers. Let us start with those names, because they tell you a great deal about the chapter without a word of explanation. In the standard Codex Astartes structure that governs most chapters, the officer ranks carry names that are functional and martial and somewhat cold. Captains, chaplains, librarians, apothecaries, efficient descriptors for warriors with specific roles. The Celestial Lions have translated all of these into something more expressive, more rooted in the language and imagery of their homeworld. Their captains are war leaders, the ones who direct the fury of the pride, who guide the hunt toward the kill. Their chaplains, those warrior priests who carry the faith and the memory and the spiritual integrity of a Space Marine chapter, are called Death Speakers. This is a remarkable title if you sit with it for a moment. Not just priests, not just preachers, Death Speakers. They speak for the dead. They give voice to the fallen so that the living do not forget. In a culture that values storytelling above almost any other art, To be the one who tells the stories of those who can no longer speak for themselves is a sacred duty indeed. Their librarians, those psychically gifted warriors who wield the power of the warp as a weapon, are called spirit walkers. There is something almost shamanic in that title, something that evokes ancient traditions of human cultures where certain people could walk between worlds, between the realm of the living and the realm of something else. For a chapter whose world was defined by jungles and plains and the great sweep of natural forces, a warrior who can literally reach into the invisible world of psychic power and draw something out of it is exactly that kind of figure. Their apothecaries are called lifebinders. Again, the title goes beyond the functional. Yes, an apothecary is the chapter's medic, the warrior who tends to wounds and extracts gene seed from the fallen. But lifebinder suggests something more intentional than mere medical practice. It implies that life itself is something that can be bound, woven, preserved against the forces that would undo it. And in a culture that cares so deeply about the continuation of the chapter's story and the preservation of its people, this feels like exactly the right name. Their sergeants are pride leaders, which is perhaps the most overtly lionish of all the titles, but also the one that most clearly evokes the nature of a tight-knit small unit. A pride of lions is a family unit as much as a hunting group. The pride leader is not just a tactical commander of a squad. They are the heart of a small family, the one who keeps the unit together, who maintains the bonds that make the pride more than a collection of individuals. And all of these officers, from the war leaders down to the pride leaders, carry their rank not as a barrier between themselves and their brothers, but as a shared responsibility. The Celestial Lions are genuinely informal, in a way that most Space Marine chapters are not. There are accounts of basic battle brothers speaking to their war leaders with a direct honesty that would have been remarkable, or perhaps scandalous, in a chapter with more rigid hierarchy. The relationship between the ranks of the Lions is closer to the relationship between experienced hunters than to the more militaristic command structures of, say, the Ultramarines or the Iron Hands. This informality does not mean indiscipline. Do not misunderstand. On the battlefield, the Lions are focused, controlled, and lethal. Their combat doctrine is flexible and aggressive, drawing on that hunting culture heritage of reading the situation, adapting quickly, pressing the advantage. All arms working in balanced coordination, each element capable of independent action, but always oriented toward the collective success of the strike. They are true scions of Dorn, in that they fight to win, not to impress. There is no wasted motion in the Lions' way of war, even if there is warmth in their way of brotherhood. The other great pillar of their character is the one we have already touched on, the stories. The Celestial Lions have a deep and genuine culture of storytelling that goes far beyond what most chapters maintain in their formal liturgy and histories. Where other chapters might record battles in the dry language of military reports and have their chaplains recite battles in the language of religious ritual, the Lions tell stories, real ones that carry the humanity of the moment, not just who won and what the casualties were, but what it felt like to stand in the Mannheim Gap with the entire chapter bleeding out around you, what the air tasted like, what your brothers said before the end. Before battle, senior Lions sometimes tell stories to their brothers. Not just motivational speeches, actual narratives about battles fought and warriors who gave everything. There is a tradition implied in the lore that even a humble battle brother who is gifted with words, who can shape an account into something that makes his listeners feel the weight of it, will be honored for that gift in a way that transcends formal rank. A warrior who preserves the stories is doing something the chapter considers sacred. This is why the Celestial Lions cannot stay quiet when they see something wrong. It is not political calculation that drives them to challenge the Inquisition. It is the fact that their entire culture revolves around the truth of what happened and the obligation to speak it. When they witness an atrocity, the only question their culture allows them to ask is not whether to speak, but how and where. To see a terrible thing and say nothing about it would be the deepest kind of dishonor possible in their tradition. It would be letting the story be told wrong. And it is worth pausing here to note that this is what makes the Celestial Lions feel so genuinely human in a science fantasy setting that can sometimes reduce its characters to archetypes. They are a chapter that has carried its humanity forward from a warm world of hunters and stories into the cold, mechanized warfare of the 41st millennium. they have not lost that warmth. They have not let the process of becoming superhuman warriors strip away the thing that made their culture meaningful. They hug their brothers. They laugh at each other's stories. They grieve openly and specifically for their dead, rather than processing loss as tactical data. They know each other's names, the way family members do. And in the chapter's specific case, they know each other's names because those names have been spoken out loud in stories, many times, by many voices, in the firelight of a tradition that stretches back to the planet they came from. When the Inquisition begins its long campaign against the Celestial Lions, it is not just attacking a military unit, it is attacking a family, it is attacking a culture. It is trying to silence a chapter that believes in its very core that silence in the face of injustice is the worst possible sin. And the Inquisition will discover, slowly and at tremendous cost to the Lions, that you can kill members of a family. You can destroy its property and sabotage its fleet and murder its leaders one by one. But you cannot kill the story. It is also worth noting, before we leave this section, that the Celestial Lions at full strength are a conventional chapter, approximately 1,000 warriors divided into 10 companies in broad adherence to the Codex Astartes, though with their own cultural deviations from the strict letter of that document. They have their own fleet, their own homeworld and fortress monastery, their own recruitment process, drawing from the hunter tribes of Elysium 9. At their peak, they are formidable, a chapter with 4,000 years of history and tradition and combat experience behind them. This context matters when we begin to count the losses that the Inquisition inflicts upon them, because every number we reach eventually represents not just a warrior, but a voice, a story, a person who knew the chapter's tradition and had promised to carry it forward. Their armor is gold and azure, their hearts are warm, their honor is absolute. And an inquisitor named Apollyon is about to light the fuse. Part 4. Qatar, the wound that would not close. 948. M41. A world called Qatar. By the standards of the things that typically fill the Warhammer 40,000 setting with conflict, the Qatar insurrection is a relatively minor event. A shrine world, one of those planets dedicated to the Imperial faith, whose economy and culture and population all revolve around the worship of the God Emperor, has fallen into heresy. This is not unusual in a galaxy where the forces of chaos are always probing for weaknesses in humanity's faith. The priesthood of Qatar, isolated and perhaps spiritually hollow in the way that institutions sometimes become when they have been too long removed from genuine belief, had turned to the ruinous powers, specifically to Slanesh, the chaos god of excess and sensation, whose particular form of corruption tends to work through exactly this kind of spiritual emptiness, filling the void with something that feels true enough to believe. The heresy spread from the priesthood outward through Qatar's society like ink in water. The planetary leadership was drawn in. The local defense forces were corrupted. And then the corruption spread further into the nearby star systems, reaching military regiments stationed across the subsector, pulling them into the orbit of Qatar's blasphemy, with a force that speaks to how deeply the false faith had taken hold. By the time the Inquisition took official notice, this was not just a planetary problem. It had become a regional one. Inquisitor Apollyon was the man tasked with solving it, and he understood immediately that he lacked the tools to do the job alone. The Inquisition's personal resources are considerable. Inquisitors can call upon stormtrooper squads and interrogator chaplains and the various specialist operatives that serve the Holy Ordos. But what Apollyon needed was something the Inquisition does not directly command: a substantial surface assault force capable of breaking an entrenched planetary defense. He needed Space Marines. He petitioned the Celestial Lions, and 5 companies of the chapter responded. This is already a significant commitment. 5 companies represents roughly half of a chapter at full strength, roughly 500 warriors. They made planetfall against essentially no opposition. The orbital defenses of Qatar had been compromised, or were simply insufficient to challenge a Space Marine assault. The Lions deployed to the surface and did what they do. They hunted. They pursued the armed elements of the rebellion through the cities and settlements of Qatar, with the patient, methodical efficiency of warriors who had been doing this for 4,000 years. Every soldier who raised a weapon in service of the false faith found themselves facing the golden warriors of Elysium 9. Every militia unit, every PDF regiment, every squad of corrupted guardsmen systematically located, engaged, and destroyed. In 3 months, it was over. The armed rebellion on Qatar was crushed. The Lions had eliminated every person who carried a weapon in the name of Qatar's heresy, from the most fanatical apostate preacher to the last ragged PDF conscript who had been swept up in the insurrection's momentum. The fighting men and women of Qatar's rebellion were dead, and the chapter was preparing to leave. The defenseless civilian population remained 8 billion people who had lived under a corrupt priesthood, who had perhaps been misled into worship of powers they barely understood, but who were no longer armed and no longer a military threat. The normal course of events in such situations is to hand them over to the ecclesiarchy, who would send new priests to begin the long work of reclaiming those souls for the Emperor's light. The Celestial Lions believed this was what was going to happen. They had done their part. They had bled for this world. Some of their brothers had died on its surface. They boarded their ships and prepared to leave, and as they were pulling away from orbit, Apollyon's warship opened fire. Not on an enemy, on Qatar itself. The Imperial Navy vessels that had maintained the orbital blockade joined in on Apollyon's order, targeting cities and population centers. The weapons used were cyclonic torpedoes, the instruments of exterminatus, the final sanction that transforms an entire world's biosphere into a dead zone, the nuclear and chemical option that the Imperium reserves for planets that are too thoroughly lost to be salvaged by any other means. In the course of hours, Qatar's 8 billion people, the vast majority of whom had never personally committed a violent act in the name of chaos, who had simply been deceived and misled, were destroyed, along with the world that had held them. The Celestial Lions were watching. They were still in the system, still close enough to see what was happening, still in Vox contact with the fleet they had just finished fighting alongside, and they were, to use the word that appears multiple times in their subsequent accounts, horrified. They demanded that the bombardment cease. They demanded an explanation. Captain Saul of the Imperial Navy flagship, caught between his loyalty to his own naval chain of command and whatever personal conscience he possessed, tried to halt the exterminatus order. He could not. An inquisitor's command supersedes Imperial Navy authority. This is the nature of inquisitorial power. It is not bound by the normal structure of the Imperium's military and governmental hierarchy. When an inquisitor speaks with the authority of their rank, only another inquisitor or the High Lords themselves can countermand them. Apollyon refused to be questioned. He informed the Lions that he had determined the entire population of Qatar to be tainted beyond salvation, that the exterminatus had been necessary, and he thanked them for their efforts in clearing the armed resistance. He seemed to genuinely believe, or at least, he presented this belief with total conviction that what he had done was correct, that Qatar had been too far gone. That 8 billion souls, corrupted even slightly by Slaaneish's influence, could not be trusted, that the disease was too deep, that the only certain cure was to end the world. Maybe he was right. The accounts we have access to are filtered through the perspective of the Lions, who obviously disagreed profoundly with his conclusion. But even taking the most charitable interpretation of Apollyon's actions, even granting that he might have genuinely believed the population beyond recovery, the response of the Celestial Lions is understandable. They had just fought to cleanse a world. They had taken that job seriously, as they take everything seriously. They had followed the rules of engagement they understood to apply: destroy the armed rebellion, leave the civilians for the ecclesiarchy. And then, before their ships had even cleared the system, those 8 billion people were ash. The honor of the chapter had been used. The Lions had been the instrument through which Apollyon cleared the defensive threat so that he could conduct an exterminatus on a world that did not technically meet the criteria for that most extreme of measures. Exterminatus is reserved for worlds that are too far lost to be ever recovered by any other means. Planets where the chaos corruption has gone so deep into the physical world itself that no military or spiritual intervention can cleanse it. That was not Qatar. Qatar's rebels had just been defeated in 3 months by 5 companies of Space Marines. Whatever spiritual contamination lingered in the surviving population could have been addressed. The Lions knew this. And in the culture of a chapter that cannot let the wrong story stand uncorrected, knowing it meant speaking it, They broadcast condemnations of Apollyon's actions to every imperial outpost and regional governor in the subsector. They sent formal warnings. They documented everything: the timeline of the campaign, the nature of the rebellion, the fact that the population had been unarmed and defenseless when the exterminatus was ordered. They made as much noise as a Space Marine chapter could make, which, given the reputation and resources of an Adeptus Astartes chapter, is considerable noise. And then they did something that was simultaneously the most honorable and perhaps the most politically naive thing they could have done. They assembled a delegation of their most senior officers, their death speakers, and war leaders, the spiritual and military leadership of the chapter, and they put those officers on a strike cruiser with orders to go to Terra, to Holy Terra itself, to stand before whatever powers would listen and demand an official investigation into what Inquisitor Apollyon had done on Qatar. That ship never arrived. 2 years later, it was found. Or rather, the wreckage was found drifting in space, deep within Orc-controlled territory, wildly off course from any route that would lead it to Terra. Every person aboard was dead. The interior of the vessel, according to the account in the chapter's historical records, showed signs of a catastrophic warp incident, the kind of violent, uncontrolled emergence from the Imperium that happens when a ship's Geller field fails, or when a warp drive malfunctions catastrophically. The hull itself showed no signs of weapons fire. It looked, for all external purposes, like a ship that had suffered a terrible navigational accident. The Celestial Lions did not believe it was an accident. They could not prove it was not. That distinction between what they knew and what they could demonstrate will become a recurring theme in everything that follows. They kept pushing. For decades, they sent messages to imperial authorities requesting an investigation into Qatar. They refused to work alongside agents of the Inquisition again after what had happened. They kept their condemnations active and public, this stubborn refusal to drop the matter that is so absolutely characteristic of Dorn's bloodline. You do not tell a son of Dorn to let something go. Dorn himself held the walls of the imperial palace when everything else was falling. His sons hold grievances with the same tenacity they hold defensive lines. And somewhere in the vast, shadowy structure of the Inquisition, among the individuals who had taken Apollyon's side, or simply took offense at a Space Marine chapter, publicly criticizing their institutions, a decision was made. The Celestial Lions had been an embarrassment. They had dared to challenge inquisitorial authority. They had to be shown what happens to a chapter that forgets its place. 50 years after Qatar, the Third War for Armageddon began, and the Inquisition saw its opportunity. Part 5. Armageddon, where chapters go to die. 998. M41. The entire chapter deploys. That single fact should tell you how seriously the Celestial Lions took their duty. The Third War for Armageddon was not just a war. It was the largest greenskin offensive in recorded Imperial history, led by the single most dangerous greenskin warlord who had ever drawn breath. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the Beast of Armageddon, had already launched one invasion of that vital hive world 57 years earlier in the Second War. Now he returned with a force that dwarfs anything the Imperium had faced from the greenskins in living memory. The greenskin horde that poured onto Armageddon's surface in 998, M41, was incomprehensible in its scale, and it drew in military resources from across the segmentum, more than 25 Space Marine chapters, dozens of Astra Militarum regiments, multiple Titan legions. The Celestial Lions brought 983 warriors to Armageddon. Their entire chapter, save for the most remote training cadres that had not yet been recalled. They had enough strength left in their fleet to make a proper showing. They deployed to the west coast of Armageddon Prime, to the region surrounding a settlement called Hive Volcanus, and they immediately went into action, defending it against the greenskin tide. For 3 months and 16 days, they fought without stopping, and they died at a rate that no other chapter present on Armageddon even came close to matching. This requires some unpacking, because on the surface, it might seem like simply the consequence of tough fighting. Armageddon was a brutal campaign. Every chapter that participated took losses. The death guard of war, not chaos, just the ordinary grinding attrition of holding a hive world against millions of determined Xenos, is terrible enough. But the Celestial Lions' losses were categorically different from what the other chapters were experiencing, and the differences are damning when you look at them clearly. In battle after battle, the Lions were deployed to reinforce elements of the Imperial Guard that were already dead by the time the Lions arrived. This happens in war. Communication breaks down. Situations change faster than orders can follow, but it happened to the Celestial Lions again and again, with a consistency that goes beyond bad luck. Every time they were directed to reinforce a friendly position, they arrived to find only corpses. Every time, they found themselves deep in enemy territory without the support they had been promised, cut off, forced to fight their way out. On at least 15 separate and documented occasions, the Lions were ordered to advance on specific objectives, critical positions that needed to be taken, only to find themselves arriving without any of the planned support forces, without the reinforcements that had been promised in the orders. 15 times. That is not a run of bad luck. That is a pattern. Their communications were compromised. The intelligence they received was systematically wrong, consistently failing to account for enemy positions that should have been visible on any reasonable scan. Their supplies from orbit became increasingly unreliable as their campaign progressed. Rearming runs that should have been routine became rare and then rarer still. Dropships were destroyed in the upper atmosphere. On one occasion, Vulcanus' own wall guns, Imperial weapons, manned by Imperial crews, malfunctioned and destroyed an incoming shipment of supplies, blowing 7 fully loaded Thunderhawk gunships out of the sky. 7 gunships, each carrying hundreds of kilograms of ammunition and equipment that the chapter desperately needed, destroyed by their own side's weapons due to a convenient malfunction. Their scout contingents, those forward observers and intelligence gatherers, without whom a chapter is fighting blind, began to go silent with disturbing frequency. Sometimes the Lions found their scouts' bodies. More often, the scouts simply vanished, and no explanation was ever provided. Their fleet above Armageddon was being steadily ground down in the orbital war. This is less suspicious in isolation. The void battles above Armageddon were themselves catastrophic, and many Imperial vessels were lost throughout the campaign. But the specific manner in which the Lions' ships were lost carries its own weight. Their battle barge Serenkai was boarded and overwhelmed after it inexplicably pulled out of the Black Templars' formation during a combined action, apparently having never received the orders to maintain formation orders that the Templars' records show were issued on secured Vox channels that should have reached the Serenkai without difficulty. Their strike cruiser Lavi was destroyed after a collision with another damaged Imperial vessel. Their strike cruiser Nubica was boarded and chose self-destruction over capture. Within mere weeks of arriving on Armageddon, half the chapter was dead. Let that sink in. 3 months into a campaign that would last years overall, 500 warriors of the Celestial Lions were gone. Every chapter goes through hard times in the 41st millennium, but this rate of attrition, this consistency of catastrophe in every domain, simultaneously communications, intelligence, supply, fleet, scout operations, is beyond any reasonable explanation that does not involve deliberate interference. The remaining Lions did not have proof. What they had was a growing and terrible certainty, the kind that comes from being experienced warriors who have navigated enough battles to know when the universe is simply unkind versus when something has a hand in the disasters that keep finding you. They talked among their remaining officers about what they saw. They compared notes. The picture that emerged was not random misfortune. Someone was killing them. Not directly, not in open battle, but through the careful manipulation of the systems and structures that a Space Marine chapter depends on to function. Someone with access to Hive Command's intelligence feeds was feeding the Lions false information. Someone with connections to the Imperial Navy's command structure was ensuring that supply runs and rearming flights to the Lions' positions suffered convenient failures. Someone wanted the Celestial Lions to run out of bullets and brothers on Armageddon, one bad day at a time. But even knowing this, even carrying that knowledge like a stone in their chests as they watched their brothers fall, the Lions could not stop. They were in a war. Hive Vulcanus needed defending. The Greenskins were real, and the threat they represented was real, and abandoning the mission would have been a betrayal of everything the chapter stood for, regardless of what was being done to them behind the scenes. So they fought on, bleeding and burning and slowly running out of everything. And then came the Mannheim Gap, Part 6. The Mannheim Gap, a name that echoes. The Mannheim Gap is a canyon, a fault in the earth of Armageddon, one of those geological facts that are simply there, neither threatening nor inviting in themselves, just a feature of the landscape that military commanders look at and start doing calculations about. Canyons are natural choke points. They channel movement, create fields of fire, provide concealment for forces on either side. In the brutal, grinding war for Armageddon, geography matters as much as firepower. The gap ran through the mountains north of Hive Volcanus, cutting through the hard substrate of that battered world. And according to Hive Command's intelligence, the gap had become something very specific and very dangerous. A construction yard for greenskin gargants. Gargants are the greenskins' version of Imperial Knights or Titans, massive walking war machines of brutal, improvised engineering that can change the balance of an entire battlefield. If the gargants in the Mannheim Gap became operational, the intelligence said, the tide would turn permanently against Hive Volcanus. They had to be destroyed before that happened. 500 celestial lions were sent to do it, the last half of the chapter, the entirety of what remained after the previous months of catastrophic attrition. The lions reconnoitered, watched the gap with every sensor they had, assessed the situation as carefully as any experienced chapter would. Their observations suggested the gargants were inactive dormant, still under construction, not yet powered up and dangerous. The lions had the numbers and the firepower to destroy them if they moved fast and hard before the machines could be awakened. They went in, every surviving tank, every remaining warrior, 500 space marines, and all their armor, advancing down into the canyon in battalion formations because orbital bombardment was blocked by primitive void shielding, and drop pod assault was not viable for such a large force. They moved with the precision and determination of warriors who had already spent months fighting and bleeding for this world, and who understood exactly what was at stake. The gargants were not dormant, they were waiting. That specific detail that the machines were not sleeping but simply motionless, waiting for the lions to be fully committed to the canyon before awakening, tells you everything about the nature of the ambush. This was not a greenskin horde that happened to be in position when the lions arrived. This was a prepared trap. Someone had known the lions were coming, had known their approach route and their tactic and their timeline, and had coordinated with the greenskin forces to ensure that when 500 warriors of the Celestial Lions were deepest in the canyon, the jaws would close. The gargants woke up, and then, from warrens dug into the walls of the canyon itself, from tunnels that had been excavated and concealed in the rocky ground beneath the lions' boots, thousands upon thousands of greenskins poured out. They had been buried there, waiting in the dark beneath the earth, their overlord patient enough to hold them underground for however long was necessary. The canyon filled with bodies. The exit was cut off. The greenskins surged around the lions' flanks and rear, filling the gap between the chapter and any hope of withdrawal. And then came the detail that the survivors would never forget. From the canyon walls above, sniper fire began. Not the crude, powerful, inaccurate fire of greenskin projectile weapons. The lions knew what that sounded like, knew the difference between a greenskin marksman and a trained Imperial operator. This fire was different, viciously precise. Laser weapons, the kind that the Imperium issues to its specialist units. Long-last sniper rifles. The weapons of Vindicare assassins and elite Imperial Guard sniper teams, and the various specialist operatives who work in service of organizations that have the resources to deploy such things. The shots were targeted with clinical precision at the chapter's most important personnel, not at the mass of battle brothers, specifically at the officers, death speakers, war leaders, spirit walkers, pride leaders. Anyone with rank, anyone whose loss would cripple the chapter's ability to function, struck through the helmet from above with laser precision that had nothing to do with greenskin marksmanship. 4 hours. It took 4 hours for the surviving lions to cut their way back out of the Mannheim Gap, abandoning a sea of dead tanks and fallen brothers, their gene seed lying unharvested in the canyon because their lifebinders were dead or dying too, unable to perform the sacred ritual of recovery that would preserve their brother's biological legacy for future generations. The gene seed of half the chapter, the biological inheritance of warriors who had died in service to the Emperor, was left to rot in the dirt of Armageddon, because someone with access to Imperial weapons and the skills to use them had ensured that the people whose job it was to recover it were among the first to fall. They fought free. They made it back to Hive Volcanus. By the end of that day, 3 officers remained in the entire chapter above the rank of Pride Leader. 3. A Death Speaker named Julkara, a War Leader named Vakembe, a Lifebinder named Ktuk, and the last surviving Lifebinder, the chapter's only remaining apothecary, did not survive the first night. He was found at dawn the next morning, slumped against the chapter's last Land Raider, shot through his helmet's eye lens. The gene seed he had been carrying, the biological material that represented the future of the Celestial Lions, was gone. Someone had taken it. Someone had moved through a Space Marine chapter's secured position in the darkness, put a laser shot through an apothecary's head, and stolen the last gene seed that stood between the chapter and permanent biological death. The message was clear, even without a signature. The Inquisition had been using the Greenskins as cover. The coordination between the ambush at Mannheim and the surgical targeting of officers, and the subsequent assassination of the last Lifebinder. This was not a series of unfortunate coincidences. This was a campaign of deliberate elimination, carried out with the resources and authority of an organization that could reach anywhere in the Imperium and was accountable to essentially no one. The phrase that would eventually enter the community's vocabulary for this kind of thing, the term orc snipers, used sarcastically to refer to implausible cover stories for Inquisition actions, comes directly from Armageddon, because that is what the official narrative called the sniper fire in the Mannheim Gap. Orc snipers. The Greenskin forces, known for their crude, inaccurate, improvised weaponry, supposedly had sniper teams capable of the kind of precision that only specialist Imperial weapons can achieve, making shots that would be remarkable even for a trained Vindicare assassin. Orc snipers. The surviving Lions knew what had happened. They had 96 warriors left out of 983. They had lost their fleet. They had lost their officers. They had lost their apothecary, and with him, the gene seed of their fallen brothers. They had no way to rebuild. They had no way to go home. They were stuck on a war world with fewer than 100 warriors, running out of ammunition because the supply runs had stopped entirely, and the people who had done this to them were untouchable. Death Speaker Julkara sent a message. He sent it to Reclusiarch Grimaldus of the Black Templars. Part 7. 96 lions left the hardest choice. Merrick Grimaldus, the hero of Hell's Reach. If you know anything about Black Templars lore, you know this name. Grimaldus is one of the most compelling characters. The Third War for Armageddon produced a chaplain of fierce faith and immovable will who had just spent months holding Hive Hell's Reach against the Greenskin Tide in a campaign that buried him under the ruins of a temple and left him for dead. He had survived. He had been pulled from the rubble. He was convalescing when a crashed Storm Eagle was found in the Badlands between Hell's Reach and Volcanus. The gunship was unidentified. Whatever colors it had carried had been scoured away by Armageddon's brutal seasonal storms, the storms called the Season of Fire, that lashed the planet with ash and acid winds. Grimaldus and his subordinate Cyneric, a chaplain initiate, went out to investigate. Inside, they found a dead space marine in gold armor and a handheld hololithic recorder. The recording was from Death Speaker Julkara, wavering like a ghost on the hololithic display, his skull-faced chaplain's helm under one arm, his voice carrying the weight of everything the chapter had lost. The message was simple and devastating in its directness. Grimaldus. They lied to us about the Mannheim Gap. They sent us here to die. Grimaldus went to Volcanus. He arrived at the Lions' forward base already overrun, barely functioning, the remaining brothers loading their Thunderhawks with whatever supplies they could still salvage from the ruins of their own position, moving with one hand always near a bolter because they could not trust the territory even behind their own lines. A lone warrior came forward to meet him, black helmet of a Pride Leader. When he removed it, Grimaldus saw what the author Aaron Dembski-Bowden describes as a face of warm, rich brown complexion, the face of a man born to equatorial climes, a hunter's face, a warrior's face, worn by months of fighting and loss. This was Pride Leader Ekene Dubaku, and he was the highest-ranking surviving officer in the Celestial Lions chapter, a squad sergeant. The future of the chapter rested on a squad sergeant. Dubaku told Grimaldus everything, and what emerged from the telling was exactly what the reader of this history has already pieced together. Systematic betrayal, Inquisition-coordinated interference, deliberate channeling of the Lions into situations designed to destroy them. The pattern was unmistakable once laid out in full, even if proving it through imperial courts would be another matter entirely. But here is where the story reaches its most genuinely human moment, the moment that makes this chapter's narrative more than just a political thriller dressed in ceramite and bolter rounds. Because when Dubaku finished telling Grimaldus what had happened and what the survivors intended to do about it, he delivered a decision that Grimaldus could not accept and could not help but understand. The Lions were going back to the Mannheim Gap. They were going to die there. Not as a last stand in the heroic sense of warriors going down, fighting for a purpose. Not even primarily as an attempt to complete the objective of destroying the Orc fortification, though that was part of it. They were going to die there because the chapter was already dead, because there was no realistic path to rebuilding from 96 warriors without gene seed and without fleet and without officers, and because their bones would lie alongside their brothers' bones in the canyon where half the chapter had fallen. In the culture of the Celestial Lions, where you chose to die had meaning, and they chose to die in the place where their family had died, not in some distant fortress monastery while waiting out centuries of humiliation. Grimaldus heard this. He understood the logic and the honor in it. He also refused it entirely. His counter-argument was not sentimental. He did not tell them that dying was wrong or that survival was always better than a glorious end. He was a Black Templar. He understood glorious deaths. What he told them was that 100 warriors dying in one last brilliant charge was a disservice to the Imperium that needed every Space Marine chapter it could retain. That their deaths, no matter how noble, would produce nothing. That the Inquisition wanted this exact outcome, a chapter that had been ground down and had then chosen to end itself, removing the inconvenient witnesses and allowing the whole Qatar affair to be quietly buried. He told them he would not bless their suicide. He would not perform the last rites over warriors who had chosen to die when they could have chosen to live. And then he left, and he went to work. Part 8. Blood and Fire. The Second Battle of Mannheim. What Grimaldus did next is the kind of thing that earns a warrior a permanent place in the records of his chapter. He used something that a more humble man might not have had access to, his own reputation. He was the hero of Hellsreach, the man who had been buried alive in a temple and survived. The chaplain who had stood at the Vox and delivered the sermon that held the defenders of Hive Hellsreach together during their darkest hour. Every Imperial Guard regiment in Hellsreach knew his face and his voice. Every officer had at some point in the previous months heard Grimaldus as the human or superhuman anchor to which they tied their courage when it threatened to drift away. From orbit, using the powerful communications array of the Black Templars' flagship, the Eternal Crusader, Grimaldus spent hours on Vox. He spoke to 81 Astra Militarum officers. He spoke to 11 naval captains. He had Rubicon-grade clearance, one of the highest security rankings in the Imperial military, and no one challenged his authority to issue the orders he issued. He was pulling guard regiments out of Hellsreach, which was now well defended, to the point where entire battalions sat idle with nothing to do, and directing them to march. He also sent a message to the Lions. 6 words, deliberately chosen to be as simple as possible because the transmissions were certainly being monitored, certainly being read by eyes that had no loyalty to the Lions or to Grimaldus's intentions. No pity, no remorse, no fear. The war cry of the Black Templars. The promise that they were not done yet. The Imperial Guard columns that marched on the Mannheim Gap from Hellsreach were enormous. Tanks, infantry, artillery, all of it, moving across the brutal terrain of Armageddon's wastelands, under Armageddon's bloody skies, converging on a canyon where the corpses of the Celestial Lions fallen still lay in the dirt, their golden armor, fouled by months of exposure to a world that had been trying to kill everything on it for decades. The bodies had been desecrated, heaped into barricades alongside the bodies of the greenskins who had killed them, their ceramite plating useless for the crude technology of their killers, and thus left as decoration for the walls of flesh and bone that now lined the canyon. The assault went in. It was massive, and it was terrible, and it cost the lives of enormous numbers of the Astra Militarum regiments that Grimaldus had pulled from Hellsreach men and women who were fighting someone else's battle in a canyon they had never heard of, dying in the mud because a Space Marine chaplain had asked them to, and they had said yes because it was Grimaldus who asked, and because it was the right thing to do. The greenskins in the gap were present in grotesque force. The Gargants that had survived the initial engagement months before were still there, repaired or under repair, and their weapons came down on the advancing Imperial forces in cascading bombardments that tore through vehicle armor and infantry alike. The Lions were there too, all 96 of them, fighting not in the silence of resigned men accepting their deaths, but with the controlled fury of warriors who had been given a reason to live and were fighting with everything they had to justify that reason. They fought toward the heart of the Greenskin stronghold, toward the Orc warlord named Thogfang, whose forces had been the instrument, whether knowing or not, of the chapter's destruction. The battle was grinding and murderous. For every meter of ground gained, Imperial blood was spent. The canyon walls were black with smoke and orange with flame. The ground was knee-deep in the accumulated evidence of months of war. The Lions moved through it with the focus of warriors who had already lost everything except their lives and their honor, and the chance to reclaim one of those things before the day was over. Grimaldus himself fought, because of course he did. He is not the kind of man who coordinates battles from a safe distance. He went into the canyon with the Lions and the guard, his Crozius maul crackling with the energy of a weapon designed to end the things that most weapons cannot touch. And eventually, inevitably, in a battle of this kind, the enemy came for the figure most visibly associated with the attacking force's command. Thogfang came, the largest greenskin any lion had ever seen. Scrapwork armor of absurd thickness, a powered claw that could shear through ceramite plating like paper, the impossible vitality of a greenskin warlord who had survived decades of war by being simply too big and too stubborn to die from anything a conventional enemy could do to it. Grimaldus fought it. He was driven to his knees. He was taken off his feet. And then Dubaku stepped forward. This is the moment that everything in the story has been building toward. Not just tactically, not just narratively, but in terms of what it means for a chapter that has been ground down to nothing and is trying to remember who it is. The last senior officer of the Celestial Lions, a man who had just weeks ago been a squad sergeant, faced the creature that had been the instrument of his chapter's destruction. He had maybe 40 brothers left standing at that point. His armor was damaged. His weapons were inadequate against something that had shrugged off everything else thrown at it. He looked at Thogfang and spoke into the noise of battle, and the account says that Grimaldus, who was on the ground nearby, heard the words as clearly as if they had been spoken directly to him. In whatever underworld your foul breed believes, you shall tell your pig-blooded ancestors that you died to the blade of Iceni of Elysium, Lion of the Emperor. They fought. Dubaku, lacking the power to simply overpower the warlord, used speed instead, never blocking the creature's attacks, because he could not survive a direct hit from that powered claw, always dodging, always moving, bleeding from a dozen places where the impacts he could not entirely avoid still landed. His chainsaw blade found gaps in the creature's armor and put wounds in. The warlord found Dubaku's arm and crushed it, found his leg and cut through it. And Dubaku, lying on his back in the blood and filth of the canyon floor, with one arm and one leg, and what must have been a pain that would have killed a normal human being 3 times over, put a bolt round through the creature's throat with a weapon handed to him by the chaplain initiate Ceneric, while Grimaldus held the warlord's head back with a chain wrapped around its neck. Thogfang died, headless, his armored body standing for a moment in the sheer stubborn animal refusal to fall that seemed to define the creature's entire existence, and then toppling into the blood and mud that was Armageddon's gift to everything that had ever fought on its surface. Above, the orbital void shields that had been protecting the gap failed, blown by a Steel Legion team that had spent the entire battle quietly working toward the shield's base while everyone else fought. And with the shields down, Grimaldus triggered the 4th and final thing he had asked of the Eternal Crusader before going to the surface. The sky went black with drop pods. High Marshal Helbrecht and the Black Templars had returned to Armageddon, not for the main war that was winding down, but for this, for a canyon full of survivors who needed one last push to finish what they had started. The Knights of Dorne fought one last time on Armageddon, and the Mannheim Gap was cleared, and the battle that had consumed the chapter came to its end. Helbrecht came to the surface himself. He found Dubaku armless on one side, legless on the other, propped up by Grimaldus and Ceneric, because he refused to meet the High Marshal on his back. And Helbrecht, whose authority as chapter master of the Black Templars speaks for itself, did something that he apparently had no patience for argument about. He told Dubaku that he was going to survive, that the lions needed him, and he forced Dubaku to take the oath of chapter master right there, in the ruins of the canyon that had killed his brothers, with greenskin bodies still cooling around his feet. Ekene Dubaku, who had walked into Armageddon as a squad sergeant, walked out of it as chapter master of the Celestial Lions. The Black Templars gave the lions their strike cruiser blade of the Seventh Son. Helbrecht gave Dubaku a suit of ancient power armor bearing the original heraldry of the Imperial Fists Legion, dating back to the Great Crusade of the 30th millennium, a gift almost beyond measure in a universe where such relics are priceless. And a contingent of Black Templars accompanied the last of the Celestial Lions home to Elysium 9 to help them begin the slowest and most difficult work, rebuilding. From 96 warriors, without gene seed, without senior officers, without a fleet, from almost nothing. Part 9. Rebuilding from Ash, the long road back. Home. The word must have carried something complicated when those handful of surviving lions returned to Elysium 9. A world of jungles and savannas, of hunters and stories, of warm skies and the culture that had shaped everything they were. The place where new warriors were recruited and trained, where the traditions of the chapter were kept alive between campaigns, where the deep halls of their fortress monastery held the records and the relics and the names of every lion who had come before. They came back with the Black Templars beside them, with a borrowed ship and borrowed time, and the enormous weight of what had been done to them still unresolved. The Inquisition had gotten what it wanted in one sense. The chapter was crippled. They had maybe a handful of warriors who could fight, no senior officers, no apothecary, to conduct the gene seed harvest that would be necessary to even begin the process of recruiting new Marines. The chapter's future was entirely dependent on the few lifebinders they might still be able to find, and on the gene seed stored in their fortress monastery's apothecarium, the stocks of material kept against exactly this kind of catastrophic loss. The Black Templars helped where they could. A contingent remained on Elysium 9 during the critical early years, providing a security presence so that the shell of the chapter could begin rebuilding without having to simultaneously defend itself against whatever threats might come. Their assistance is, in the context of the 40th and 41st millennia, one of the most moving examples of the bonds between successor chapters and their shared genetic heritage. The Black Templars did not owe the Lions this. They chose to give it. But the practical work of rebuilding a Space Marine chapter from near extinction is not a matter of months or even years. It is a generational process. You must first identify viable aspirants from the homeworld population and recruit them. You must process them through the long and grueling series of biological alterations and surgical procedures that produce Space Marine scouts. You must train those scouts to the point where they can survive combat. You must then continue their development through the stages that produce full battle brothers, all while maintaining the chapter's existing operational commitments and defending its homeworld. Each of these stages is slow, and each one can fail. The attrition in Space Marine recruitment, even under normal circumstances, is significant. Only a fraction of the aspirants who enter the process ever complete it. And at every stage, the chapter needs experienced warriors to train and guide the new generation warriors it was now desperately short of. The Lions chapter culture became its most important resource during this period. The stories that the surviving brothers told, the traditions they preserved and passed forward, the names of the dead that they spoke aloud in the traditions of their death speakers. These things are what kept the chapter alive in the deepest sense, kept it from becoming a chapter in name only, kept it connected to the 4,000 years of history that Apollyon and his inquisitorial allies had tried to erase. There is also the question of what Primaris Space Marines may have done for the chapter. In the aftermath of the opening of the Great Rift and the commencement of Robert Guillemot's Indomitus Crusade in the early 42nd millennium, a great number of Space Marine chapters that had been reduced below operational strength received Primaris reinforcements from the stocks of new warriors that the Primarch had been developing with the Adeptus Mechanicus for over a century. The Celestial Lions were exactly the kind of chapter most in need of this kind of intervention. While the canon records do not explicitly state that Primaris Lions were created and deployed as part of the Indomitus Crusade, the scale of the program and the stated intent of strengthening chapters in dire need makes the Lions an obvious candidate. Many in the community take this as an implied development. The chapter has, in more recent lore and in the video game Space Marine 2, appeared as a fully functional fighting force with Primaris-era equipment and numbers that suggest significant recovery. But whatever the specifics of how the rebuilding was accomplished, the chapter survived. Ekene Dubaku, chapter master at the age of a squad sergeant, presided over the slow, patient work of restoration with the same focused determination that had kept him standing in a canyon full of greenskins when he had every reason to simply stop. He trained the new generation himself. He told them the stories himself. He made sure that every lion who came after him knew exactly what had been done to the chapter and why, knew the name of Inquisitor Apollyon and the world of Qatar and the Mannheim Gap and the Lifebinder shot through his helmet in the night. He made sure they knew not as a source of permanent victimhood, but as a source of identity. This is what we are. This is what was done to us. This is why we stand here now, and this is why we stand so carefully. And all the while, the threat that had nearly destroyed them had not gone away. The Inquisition had not achieved its full goal. The Celestial Lions still existed. Their story was still being told. And somewhere in the vast shadow network of that most powerful of imperial institutions, there were people who had not forgotten that either. Part 10. Alara's Veil in the Era. Indomitus Losses, Darkness, and the Death of a Chapter Master. The Great Rift. The Cicatrix Maledictum, whatever name you give it, the event that tears across the galaxy in the early 42nd millennium, divides the entire Warhammer 40,000, setting into a new and more desperate era. A wound in reality stretching from one edge of the galaxy to the other, the warp spilling through it in ways that cut off vast regions of the Imperium from each other, plunging entire sectors into the darkness, called the Imperium Nihilus, the Noctis Aeterna, the Long Night. Alara's Veil is in the Imperium Nihilus, cut off from the light of the Astronomicon that makes warp travel possible. Isolated behind the rift, the worlds of the Veil found themselves defending against a new and uniquely terrible threat. Remember the Star Scorpions? The chapter that had been declared lost and extinct when their fleet disappeared into the warp decades earlier? They came back, but they came back as something unrecognizable. A century or more, given the way time functions in and near the warp of immersion in the Immaterium, had done to them what the warp does to everything it touches long enough. It had changed them. It had corrupted them. The chapter that had once sworn to defend Alara's Veil alongside the Celestial Lions and the Emperor's Spears emerged from the depths of the Great Rift as warriors of chaos, calling themselves the Pure. The Pure. The name has that specific kind of irony that the 40th millennium occasionally generates. Warriors so convinced of their own purity that they have become the exact opposite of it. They brought with them a vast chaos war host, an organization of cultists and mutants and corrupted fighters called the Exilarchy, and turned it against the worlds they had once protected. Alara's Veil, which had needed 3 chapters to defend it at its best times and had recently been reduced to functioning with parts of 1, became a war zone of unrelenting pressure. The Emperor's Spears fought, the rebuilt fragments of the Celestial Lions fought, and slowly, grinding through what the lore describes as over a century of warfare in the timeless aberrations of the post-Rift galaxy, they lost ground. World by world, more than half of the 20 worlds of Alara's Veil fell under the control of the Exilarchy and the Pure. The Sentinels of the Veil, once 3 chapters bound by oath to defend a region, were reduced to 2 severely depleted chapters, fighting a war they were gradually losing. Ekene Dubaku still, chapter master, still bearing the bionic leg and the relic Imperial Fist's armor that had been given to him in the ruins of the Mannheim Gap, was trying to save what could be saved. As the Exilarchy's fleet approached Elysium 9, the Lion's homeworld, Dubaku did what only a chapter master with his specific background could do. He thought about his people. He put in motion plans to evacuate the planet's population. knowing that he could not save everyone, but determined to save enough that the culture of Elysium 9, the hunter people who had been providing the lions with warriors for 4,000 years, would survive somewhere. He reached out to Arakatas, the Emperor's Spear's chapter master, asking whether the evacuees could be relocated to Nemeton. The details of how many people were saved, or what happened to those who were not, remain unclear in the records we have. What is clear is that Elysium 9 itself fell, the homeworld of the celestial lions, the planet of jungles and savannas and warm skies that had been their home since the 38th millennium, was taken by the forces of the Exilarchy. But before that happened, before the situation on Elysium 9 reached its crisis point, Dubaku was aboard the Emperor's Spear's strike cruiser Hex, meeting with Arakatas to discuss the plan. They were talking about saving lives, about relocation, about the next phase of a war that had already taken too much. And while they talked, a woman named Kartash Avik, who served as a chapter serf for an Adeptus Astartes of the Mentor Legion named Amadeus Caius Incarius, who had been sent to assess the military situation in Alara's Vale, walked into the room. And Ekene Dubaku, chapter master of the Celestial Lions, the last survivor of the Mannheim Gap, the pride leader who had become a chapter master in the ruins of a canyon and spent decades rebuilding his people from 96 warriors, was decapitated. A Calidus assassin, one of the most elite and terrifying operatives in the entire Imperium warriors, who can alter their biological structure, who can become other people completely, who can insert themselves into any situation and remain undetected until they choose to act. The woman calling herself Kartash Avik had been disguised as a chapter serf for who knows how long, and when the moment came, she ended the life of the most remarkable space marine the Celestial Lions had produced in their entire 4,000-year history in an instant. It is heavily implied in the text of the novel that covers these events that this assassination was the latest operation in the same inquisitorial vendetta against the Lions that had begun on Qatar 50 years before the Mannheim Gap. The same institutional grudge, the same use of overwhelming imperial authority against a chapter that had committed the crime of speaking truth to power. The Mentor's chapter, whose operative Amadeus Caius Incarius had apparently been used as unwitting cover for the assassin, became another group with cause for anger against whoever had orchestrated this. The Emperor's Spears, who witnessed their allied chapter master murdered on their own ship, became another chapter with cause for anger. The Sons of Dorn, across multiple chapters, the Black Templars, who had already invested themselves in the Lion's survival, the Emperor's Spears, who now shared the outrage, had reason to look at what had been done and demand accounting. And somewhere above all of this, having returned to lead the Imperium in the aftermath of 10,000 years of absence, Robert Guilliman was working through the political chaos of the era Indomitus with zero tolerance for exactly this kind of institutional waste. A Space Marine chapter systematically destroyed, not by enemies of the Imperium, but by an imperial organization pursuing personal vendettas. That is precisely the kind of dysfunction that Guilliman's return was meant to address. The political implications of the Lion's story in the current timeline remain unresolved in the lore, which perhaps is appropriate. These things take time, even in the 42nd millennium. What we know is that the Celestial Lions still exist, reduced, strained, rebuilding again from a position that must feel hauntingly familiar to whatever warriors now carry the chapter's banner. They have lost their homeworld. They have lost their chapter master for the second time. They are fighting in a region of space cut off from the wider Imperium, defending worlds with the Emperor's Spears against a chaos war host that includes the corrupted remnants of the brothers they once fought alongside. And they are still standing. The story is still being told. Part 11. Why They Matter, the Lesson of the Lions. There is a temptation, when you encounter the story of the Celestial Lions, to read it primarily as a tragedy. The numbers are genuinely staggering when you add them up. 983 warriors, reduced to 96. The homeworld eventually lost. The chapter master assassinated. The allies they once stood alongside transformed into enemies. The institutional power that should have been their ally turned against them for the crime of being right about something. All of that is real, and all of it hurts if you care about this chapter at all, which you probably do by now. But the tragedy framing misses something essential about what makes the Celestial Lions one of the most important chapters in Warhammer 40,000 lore. They are not a story about defeat. They are a story about what kind of defeat is actually defeat, and what kind is not. The Inquisition wanted to silence them. That was the entire point of the Qatar affair and everything that followed. Not just to reduce their military capacity, the Lions were a capable but not uniquely powerful chapter, replaceable in the pure military calculus of an Imperium with 1,000 chapters. The point was to silence the story, to send a message, as Grimaldus himself observed at Armageddon, that whatever chapter challenged the Inquisition's authority would pay a price so severe that no other chapter would dare do the same. But they got the story wrong, because in choosing a chapter of storytellers to make their example of, they chose the one group in the entire Adeptus Astartes most constitutionally incapable of letting the story die. The culture of Elysium 9, the hunters who remembered everything in narrative form, the warriors who honored their death speakers for the skill of the tale, as much as for the strength of the sermon, these people were never going to be silenced by atrocity. Atrocity just gives you more to tell. Every surviving lion carries the story of Qatar. Every new recruit, every warrior trained by the rebuilt chapter, learns about Apollyon and the Mannheim Gap, and the lifebinder shot through his helmet in the dark. They know it the way their ancestors knew the terrain of a hunt. It is in their memory not as an old grudge to be nursed, but as identity, as the story of who they are. And because Aaron Dembski-Bowden, the author who is most responsible for the Celestial Lions lore, particularly through the novella Blood and Fire and the novel Spear of the Emperor, is a writer who understands that the best stories are the ones that illuminate something true. The Lions illuminate something important about the Warhammer 40,000 setting that the bigger, more prominent chapters sometimes obscure. The Imperium is not just. The Imperium is not good. It is the only human civilization standing between humanity and extinction in a universe full of things that would gladly eat every soul in it. But it is also a machine of immense cruelty, corruption, and institutional self-protection that grinds up individual lives and sometimes entire chapters in service of its own perpetuation. Qatar is a story that could only happen in a setting where those things are simultaneously true, where the people trying to save the Imperium from chaos are also capable of committing atrocities indistinguishable from the things chaos does, and where the bodies that are supposed to enforce accountability are themselves immune from it. The Celestial Lions exist in that tension. They are loyal. They believe in the Emperor and in the Imperium and in the mission of the Adeptus Astartes. They are not chaos sympathizers or traitors or rebels. They are honest. They looked at Apollyon on Qatar and said this was wrong, and they said it out loud, and they kept saying it, and that honesty cost them almost everything. The grimdark of the setting is not that everything is dark. It is that everything could be better than it is, and the gap between what it is and what it could be is filled with the bodies of people like the Celestial Lions, who were destroyed not because they failed in their duty, but because they succeeded, and then had the audacity to tell the truth about what they had seen. That is a profoundly human story, and it is a story that resonates across an enormous range of experiences that have nothing to do with science, fantasy, or space marines. The experience of an institution with absolute authority, misusing that authority, and then directing its resources against anyone who speaks about it is not fictional. The experience of loyal service, followed by institutional betrayal, is not fictional. The experience of a community that is targeted not because they are dangerous, but because they refuse to be silent, is not fictional. The Celestial Lions are not a metaphor for any one specific thing in the real world, but they are built from the same material that the real world is made of, and that is why they hit as hard as they do. They are also just genuinely wonderful warriors on their own terms. The culture of Elysium 9, the warmth between brothers, the storytelling tradition, the specific and evocative titles they give their officers. These things make the Lions feel alive and specific in a way that a lot of the game's 1,000-chapter roster simply does not. They feel like a people. They feel like a family. And when you understand them as a family, the losses they suffer become genuinely painful in a way that the loss of an anonymous military unit never could be. Ekene Dubaku, in particular, deserves to be remembered as one of the great characters in the setting. a squad sergeant who became a chapter master through sheer force of determination and pride, and the refusal to let his brother's deaths mean nothing, who rebuilt a chapter from 96 warriors, who trained the next generation, who carried the story forward even when the story kept trying to kill him, whose death at the hands of a Calidus assassin is enraging precisely because it is so unjust, because he had earned the right to a death in battle, earned it 10 times over, and instead was killed in a meeting room by someone hiding among the people he thought he could trust. But his death does not end the chapter's story, because that is the thing about a culture built on storytelling. The stories survive the storytellers. Dubaku's name will be spoken by every death speaker who comes after him, in every pre-battle gathering, in every tradition the rebuilt lions maintain going forward. He will be a war leader of legend, a chapter master whose story will be told exactly as it happened, not cleaned up, not heroized beyond recognition, but told truly, with all the loss and the stubborn refusal to accept that loss built into it. The Celestial Lions are the chapter nobody talks about, but they are the chapter that the Warhammer 40,000 setting needs, because they represent the cost of integrity in a universe that punishes it. They represent the value of brotherhood in a cosmos that tries to atomize everything into disconnected and controllable parts. They represent the idea that a story told truthfully, even a painful one, even one about loss and betrayal and institutional cruelty, is itself a form of resistance. They wear gold armor and azure helms. They come from a world of hunters and savannas. Their chaplains are called death speakers, and they speak for the dead because the dead deserve voices. Their apothecaries are life binders because life is something that can be woven and preserved against entropy if you choose to fight for it. Their sergeants are pride leaders because a pride is a family, and a family is what the chapter is. They were nearly destroyed. They are not destroyed. They will tell you the difference themselves, if you ask them, in the language of their traditions. The story is not finished until the last death speaker falls silent. And the last death speaker of the Celestial Lions has not fallen silent yet. They endure. The broader picture, everything connected. One of the things that makes the Celestial Lions particularly rich as a subject is how thoroughly their story connects to other parts of the 40,000 lore and creates a web of implications that ripple outward in interesting directions. The Black Templars' involvement in saving the lions at Armageddon is not simply a plot event. It is a statement about the bonds between successor chapters that carries real weight. The Sons of Rogel Dorn form what is perhaps the closest thing to a Legion-era brotherhood that still exists in the Space Marine ranks. The Imperial Fists, the Black Templars, the Crimson Fists, the Celestial Lions, they do not answer to each other in any formal sense, but there is a shared identity in the blood that goes beyond institutional loyalty. When Grimaldus risked defying the Inquisition to help the Lions, he was not violating the principles of his chapter. He was embodying them. Dorn's legacy is exactly this. You hold. You do not let what matters fall, even when the cost is severe. The Emperor's spears also deserve extended attention in any deep dive into the Alara's Veil corner of the setting. They are the survivors of the Violari, the chapter that never fell, that kept its vigil through everything, that serves as both the Lions' closest allies and the most direct contrast to them. Where the Lions are warm and communal and defined by the culture of a specific homeworld, the spears are something more austere, more barbarian in the proper sense of the word, warriors, shaped by the storm world of Nemeton into something that endures through a different mechanism. 2 chapters, 2 approaches to survival, both still standing when everything around them tries to bring them down. The Star Scorpions and their transformation into the Pure carries its own terrible weight. 3 chapters swearing to defend a region of space together, one becoming extinct through genetic failure, its surviving members transformed by the warp into instruments of destruction. 1 nearly destroyed by institutional betrayal from within the Imperium itself. 1 holding on by sheer stubbornness. The Adeptus Veilari is a story about what happens to idealistic alliances in the 41st millennium, and the answer is, they break. But what breaks them is different in each case, and the differences are illuminating. The question of what happens next for the Celestial Lions in the current canon is one that the community speculates about actively. Guilliman's return and the stated purpose of the Indomitus Crusade create obvious possibilities for the chapter's reinforcement and recovery. The Inquisition's continuing vendetta against them, demonstrated by Dubaku's assassination, creates the setup for a reckoning that has been coming since Qatar. The Emperor's spears know what happened. The Black Templars know. All the Sons of Dorn know. And, at some point, in a universe where Guilliman is actively trying to reform the worst dysfunctions of the Imperium he built, a decision will have to be made about what the Inquisition did to a loyal chapter for the crime of being honest. That reckoning has not happened yet in the published lore, but the story is not finished. A final thought on stories and silence. The Celestial Lions teach something that is worth carrying out of this video with you, past the lore and the numbers and the battles and the names. They teach that silence is not neutral. In a universe where the forces of darkness are always pressing inward, where the machinery of oppression can use its power to quiet the voices that tell inconvenient truths, the act of speaking, of naming what happened, of refusing to let the wrong story stand, is itself a form of warfare. The Death Speakers of the Celestial Lions do not just mourn their dead. They honor them by telling the truth about how they lived and how they died. They understand that a warrior whose death is explained away as an accident, whose sacrifice is absorbed into the institutional narrative of the organization that caused it, is not truly honored. Honor requires truth, and truth requires someone willing to speak it out loud and keep speaking it, even when the cost is terrible. The Inquisition tried to silence the Lions with the most powerful tools available in their setting. It nearly succeeded, but it could not finish the job because the Lions' fundamental operating principle, tell the story, tell it true, tell it even when it hurts, tell it, especially when it hurts, is simply incompatible with being silenced. You cannot silence people who define themselves by the act of speaking. You can kill them. You cannot silence them. And in the 40th millennium, in the long war between everything that wants to survive and everything that wants to consume it, surviving while telling the truth is one of the rarest and most valuable things there is. The Celestial Lions wear gold, their hearts are warm, and their death speakers are still speaking. If this was your first time encountering these warriors, drop a comment below. Let me know how you feel about them, now that you know who they are. And if you have been a Celestial Lions fan for a while, what part of their story means the most to you? I would genuinely love to know. Thank you for spending this time with these warriors. If you found this valuable, your support through subscribing and sharing this content means everything. It is what allows these stories to keep being told. Until next time, stay patient, stay curious. And remember, the story is not finished until the last Death Speaker falls silent. Extended, the weight of Dorn's legacy. To truly appreciate the Celestial Lions, you have to understand what it means to carry the genetic inheritance of Rogel Dorn in the 41st millennium, because that inheritance shapes not just the biology of the chapter, but the entire philosophical framework through which they understand their existence. Rogel Dorn was the architect of humanity's last defense during the Horus Heresy, while other Primarchs were fighting the traitors across a dozen fronts, while Sanguinius faced down Daemon Primarchs and Ferrus Manus charged into ambush, and Lemon Russ led his wolves howling across the void. Rogel Dorn was on Terra. He was building, reinforcing, planning, taking the greatest human city in the history of the species and turning it into the fortress it would need to be when the War Master's fleet arrived. The entire defense of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra, the greatest defensive action in human history, was Dorn's work. Every wall, every killing field, every choke point and firing position, and layered defensive system that made the palace hold long enough for Sanguinius and the Emperor to confront Horus, that was Dorn. And it cost him. The siege cost Dorn more than perhaps any other Primarch who survived it, because he was the one who had to watch. Every wall that fell, he had designed. Every position that was overrun, he had built. Every soldier who died fighting to hold what he had constructed, their deaths, were, in some sense, a measure of his work. He was not a detached general. He felt every loss as a failure of architecture and will, even when nothing he had built should have held as long as it did under that kind of pressure. The guilt of the survivor combined with the perfectionism of the builder produced something in Dorn that has never entirely left his sons. The Imperial Fists, and by extension all the chapters that carry Dorn's gene seed, are characterized in the lore by an almost pathological commitment to the idea of doing their duty no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter what suffering doing that duty requires. They hold walls. They stay in positions that any reasonable tactical assessment would say are untenable. They do not withdraw unless the alternative is total annihilation, and sometimes not even then. The iron within, the iron without, the Black Templar's creed is an extreme expression of this, but you see versions of it across every successor. The Celestial Lions inherit this stubbornness, this absolute refusal to yield on a matter they have decided to stand upon. But they express it differently than most of their genetic cousins, because their culture bends the Dornian inheritance in a specific and interesting direction, where the Imperial fists might hold a wall in grim, silent, disciplined silence, where the Black Templars might hold it in righteous fury and religious ecstasy. The Celestial Lions hold it while talking, while maintaining the bonds of brotherhood that make the holding meaningful rather than merely mechanical. They hold walls, and they tell each other stories about the walls they have held before, and they grieve together for the brothers who have fallen, and they hold some more. This is not weakness. Do not mistake warmth for softness. The 41st millennium has a tendency to produce the assumption that toughness and emotional coldness are the same thing, that the best warriors are the ones who have stripped away the most of their humanity in service of efficiency. The Celestial Lions are a direct rebuttal to this assumption. They are possibly the warmest chapter in the entire setting, the most emotionally present and communal, and they are also willing to fight to the last standing warrior to defend what they believe in. Those two things are not in tension. They are complementary. The brothers who know each other's names fight harder for each other. The warriors who grieve their dead are more motivated to prevent more deaths. The people who have a story they are committed to telling have a reason to survive long enough to tell it. Dorne would have understood this, probably. The Primarch who built the walls was also the Primarch who refused to leave Terra during the heresy, who stayed to defend the single most important place in human space rather than taking the fight to the enemy. He understood that some things are worth staying for. His sons, the Lions, understand it too. They stay on the worlds they have sworn to protect. They stay in their convictions about what is right. They stay in their commitment to speaking truth, even when the truth is dangerous. The stubbornness is entirely recognizable as Dorne's. The warmth in which it is wrapped is their own. There is also the physical inheritance to consider. The gene seed of Rogel Dorne carries specific biological characteristics that distinguish his sons from other Space Marine lineages. They lack the Becher's gland, the organ that allows some Space Marines to spit a corrosive acid, and in some chapters they lack the Susan membrane that allows extended periods of suspended animation. These are relatively minor functional losses compared to the serious gene seed corruptions that afflict some lineages. Dorne's sons are, in biological terms, among the most stable and least corrupted of all the Legion's descendants, which is perhaps fitting for a Primarch whose entire identity was about building things that last. The chapter's founding in the 38th millennium places them roughly 2,000 years before the events at Armageddon that nearly destroyed them. 2,000 years of history and campaigns and traditions built before a single Inquisitor made a single wrong decision on a world called Qatar. This context is important. The Lions who go to Armageddon are not young or inexperienced. They are a chapter with deep roots, deep memory, deep tradition. The warriors who fight in the Mannheim Gap are carrying 4,000 years of the chapter's identity with them, and when those warriors die, they take irreplaceable memory with them. This is another dimension of the crime that is committed against the Lions. It is not just the killing of warriors, but the destruction of living archives. Extended, the Brotherhood in practice, what chapter culture looks like. It is one thing to say that the Celestial Lions are a warm, communal, storytelling chapter. It is another thing to try to bring that to life in the imagination, in a way that makes their eventual destruction feel as real and as specific as it deserves to feel. So, let us spend some time in the chapter as it exists before the catastrophe. Imagine the fortress monastery of the Celestial Lions on Elysium 9. Unlike the cold stone fortifications of, say, the Iron Hands on Medusa, or the glacial white walls of the Space Wolf's Fang on Fenris, the Lion's home reflects its world. There are open spaces here. Courtyards where the warm air of Elysium 9's climate moves through colonnades and across floors of polished stone. Halls where the walls are not bare rock or functional ceramite plating, but carved with imagery, lions, obviously, but also hunters, savannas, the night sky above the equatorial regions of their world, the specific constellations that their people have named and told stories about for as long as memory reaches. The records and accounts suggest that meal times in the Lion's Fortress are communal in a way that distinguishes them from many chapters. Space Marines require significant caloric intake. Their enhanced metabolisms and the physical demands of constant training and combat create nutritional needs that dwarf anything a normal human would consume. But where some chapters eat in shifts, functionally and efficiently, the Lions apparently eat together when they can. The gathering around the table that their homeworld's hunter culture considers foundational to social life has not been left behind on Elysium 9. It has been brought into the chapter's daily practice. And at those gatherings, stories are told. This is not a formal liturgical exercise conducted by the Death Speakers, though the Death Speakers certainly participate and are honored when they speak. Any brother can tell a story. A battle brother who fought in a notable engagement 2 years ago might stand and recount it, not the tactical after-action report that would go into the chapter's official records, but the felt experience of it. What it was like to advance through a particular street, on a particular world. What the brother to his left said just before the enemy charge came. The specific weight of the silence between one gunshot and the next. The things that you would lose if you only kept the data. This is what a Death Speaker's training actually develops. Not just the liturgical skills of a chaplain in the orthodox sense, but the narrative craft that allows a warrior to take an experience and render it in language that other warriors can feel in their chests. The Celestial Lions choose their Death Speakers not just for faith, and for the willingness to stand at the front of a charge while chanting their chapter's prayers, but for the ability to use words the way other warriors use weapons precisely, with timing and purpose, making each one count. Pride leaders, the squad sergeants, carry an extra layer of responsibility in this culture. They are not just the tactical commanders of their small unit, but the social anchor. Every warrior in a squad knows their pride leader personally, in the way that implies genuine history and genuine trust. This is not always the case in other chapters, where rank can create distance, and the relationship between a sergeant and his squad can be more functional than familial. In the Lions, the pride is the fundamental unit of belonging, and the pride leader is the one who makes sure no one in the pride loses track of who they are or why they fight. This culture of intense personal connection between warriors creates something that is both the chapter's greatest strength and a vulnerability that the Inquisition ultimately exploits. The greatest strength. When the chapter fights, it fights as something closer to a family than a military unit, with all the ferocity and commitment that implies. Warriors who know and love their brothers fight differently than warriors who merely serve alongside each other. They take risks for each other. They cover retreats when the only logical thing to do is save themselves. They go back into the fire for people they would genuinely grieve the loss of. The vulnerability. When that family is stripped away, the loss is not just numerical. It is personal, in a way that pure military attrition is not. When the Lions lose warriors at Armageddon, they are not losing slots in a table of organization that can be filled by the next available body. They are losing brothers, people with specific faces and specific voices and specific stories that have been told around the table for years. This kind of grief is different from the formal mourning of a chapter that has maintained greater emotional distance between its members. It cuts deeper, and the 96 warriors who survive Armageddon are carrying not just their own survival, but the weight of hundreds of specific, personal losses that will never be fully replaced. The Death Speaker who serves a chapter like this occupies a role more psychologically central than in almost any other chapter, because the job is not just to maintain faith in the Emperor or to deliver the rites of battle. The job is to carry the stories of the people who are gone, to keep Julkara's voice alive after Julkara's body has fallen, to keep the name of Vularak spoken aloud after the canyon has taken him, to ensure that the Lions who come after know not just that their predecessors fought and died, but who those predecessors were, what they said and thought and believed and felt. It is impossible to listen to this and not feel something about the chapter's choice to send a delegation to Terra after Qatar. The choice that got those officers killed. The senior Death Speakers of the chapter. The The men whose specific job was to carry and tell the stories, they were the ones chosen for that delegation, because they were the ones who could most convincingly represent the chapter's grievance in terms that would resonate with whatever imperial authority might listen. And they were killed, presumably, for exactly that reason. Because the Inquisition understood that the most dangerous thing the Lions possessed was not their bolt weapons or their warships, but their ability to stand in front of powerful people and make the story of Qatar impossible to ignore or dismiss. Kill the storytellers. That is the oldest and most effective form of censorship in any culture. You do not need to burn the records if you eliminate the people who can make those records live. The Lions understood this too. This is why, even after losing their senior death speakers, even after the chapter was reduced to a fragment, Ekene Dubaku built the rebuilding process around the stories as much as around the recruitment. A new chapter master training new warriors had first to make sure the new warriors knew the old stories, what happened at Qatar, what happened at Mannheim, what the names on the rolls of honor meant individually, not just collectively. This is not dwelling in the past for its own sake. This is maintaining the thread that connects the chapter forward and backward through time, ensuring that the warriors who come after are not strangers to the warriors who came before. Extended, the scale of Armageddon and what the chapter walked into. The Third War for Armageddon deserves more context than it sometimes receives, because understanding the scale of the campaign helps you appreciate why the Lions' experience within it was so specific and so damning. Armageddon is a hive world, one of those nightmarish industrial planets that the Imperium produces in vast numbers, where billions of people live in city structures so massive and so old that they have become the landscape themselves. The hive cities of Armageddon rise kilometers into the sky, structures built upon the ruins of earlier structures, stretching down through layers of history into the poisoned earth below. The world itself is named appropriately. It has been a site of catastrophic conflict more than once. The First and Second Wars on Armageddon are significant chapters of the setting's history. The third is the largest. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka is the most dangerous greenskin in the setting's canon. This is not hyperbole, the lore is quite direct about it. The creature had led an invasion of Armageddon 57 years before the events of 998 M41 and been driven off, but not destroyed, and in those intervening decades had spent the time gathering forces that dwarfed anything that had come before. When Gazkul returned, he came with what the lore describes as the largest greenskin offensive ever recorded. Not the largest in recent memory, the largest ever. The hive world of Armageddon, which had survived 2 previous wars, found itself facing something categorically beyond what those previous wars had required it to resist. The Imperium responded with enormous resources. More than 25 Space Marine chapters sent forces, some entire chapters, some smaller contingents, some just a handful of companies, depending on what could be spared and what could reach the system in time. Dozens of Astra Militarum regiments, several Titan legions, those city-sized walking weapons whose presence on a battlefield changes the nature of what a battlefield means. Entire naval battle groups fighting in the orbital void above the planet, while millions of combatants fought on the surface below. Into this, the Celestial Lions deployed their entire chapter, 983 warriors. In the context of what Armageddon required, this was not an outsized contribution. It was exactly the kind of total commitment that the situation demanded and that the Lions' honor required of them. But it meant that the chapter had absolutely no strategic reserve. No portion of its strength was held back in safety. Every warrior, every officer, every specialist, and veteran and young brother who had not yet completed his basic training, all of them on Armageddon or in its orbital space. This is, in hindsight, what made the Lions uniquely vulnerable to the Inquisition's campaign against them. A chapter that deploys to a major war with its full strength has committed everything to a single theater of operations. Every supply line, every communication channel, every piece of intelligence that the chapter depends on runs through the command structure of that theater, a command structure that, if compromised, can be used to channel misinformation and sabotage to a single concentrated target. The Inquisition, with its access to the Hive command structure at Volcanus and its ability to operate through agents embedded in any Imperial organization, was perfectly positioned to manipulate the Lions' situation from within the very systems the chapter had to trust. The other chapters present on Armageddon did not suffer what the Lions suffered. Some chapters took heavy casualties. Armageddon was brutal for everyone, but no other chapter arrived with 983 warriors and ended with 96. No other chapter found its supply lines consistently disrupted, its intelligence consistently wrong, its leadership consistently targeted by fire that was not from the greenskins. The disparity is so stark that when the Lions survivors compared notes with the other chapters after the fact, the conclusion was unavoidable even to those who wanted to give the system the benefit of the doubt. There is a specific type of horror in what was done to the Celestial Lions at Armageddon that is different from the horror of losing warriors in battle. Battle is terrible. Deaths in battle are losses that a chapter can process, can honor, can build around. The dead have died as warriors, and their gene seed is recovered, and the chapter continues. The horror at Armageddon was the systematic removal of the chapter's ability to function as a military organization, while the chapter was actively trying to use that organization to fight a legitimate war. It was like trying to fight a battle while someone was quietly removing components from your weapons one by one. Not dramatically, not obviously, but persistently, ensuring that every time you reached for what you needed, it was either not there or would fail in a way that could be attributed to the chaos of combat. The chapter's scouts going silent. The intelligence feeds showing positions that did not match reality. The supply runs that failed. The fleet actions that went wrong. Each individual incident could be explained away. The pattern of those incidents, the sheer statistical impossibility of so many bad outcomes aligning in the same direction against the same chapter, is what reveals the hand behind them. But revealing a pattern in the heat of a campaign, when you are fighting every day just to hold what you hold and keep the people you still have alive, is enormously difficult. You cannot stop the war to conduct an investigation. You have to keep going and watch your brothers fall and know you cannot prove what you know and keep going anyway, because Hive Volcanus needs you, even as it is being used to destroy you. Extended. After Mannheim, processing the unthinkable. The 96 survivors of the Celestial Lions who returned to Hive Volcanus after the Mannheim Gap massacre were, by any reasonable standard, a broken force. Not broken in spirit. Everything about the Lions' subsequent actions suggests that their collective will was still intact, still burning with the particular stubbornness of Dorn's bloodline, but broken in practical, military terms. Let us think carefully about what 96 warriors represents in context. A full Space Marine chapter is 1,000 warriors. 96 is less than a full company. Standard Space Marine chapters have 10 companies. A first company of veterans, a second through fifth of battle companies, a sixth and seventh of tactical reserves, an eighth of assault reserves, a ninth of devastators, and a 10th of scouts. Each battle company nominally fields around 100 warriors of various specializations. The 96 survivors of the Celestial Lions represent in pure numbers less than a full battle company, but even that comparison undersells how reduced they were, because a full battle company has its officers and specialists and support structure intact. The 96 Lions were without any of that. No war leaders. The last surviving captain above Pride Leader rank had been killed 18 days before Grimaldus arrived. No Death Speakers. Julkara, the last chaplain, had died almost a month before the Second Battle of Mannheim. No Spirit Walkers, the librarians, had fallen at Mannheim or before. No Lifebinder, the last apothecary, had been shot in the head the night after the massacre. 96 warriors of various ranks below captain, without a command structure, without spiritual leadership, without the person whose job it was to preserve their gene seed, and without any realistic way to summon reinforcements or supplies from the void where their fleet had once been. And yet, they were still there, still on Armageddon, still defending the territory they had been assigned to defend. This is worth sitting with for a moment. There was nothing tactical keeping the Lions on Armageddon at this point. They could not genuinely change the outcome of the war with 96 warriors and no officers. The war was being fought by other chapters and hundreds of Imperial Guard regiments and Titan legions whose participation the Lions could not meaningfully supplement with their remaining strength. They stayed because leaving would have felt like abandonment. Because their brothers' bodies were still in the canyon. Because the story was not finished yet, and they were not going to let it end with a retreat. This is the Dorn inheritance expressing itself in the most pure and somewhat painful way. You hold, you stay. You do not leave, even when leaving is the logical thing to do, because some things are more important than the logical thing. For the Celestial Lions at this point, staying on Armageddon was not about military effectiveness. It was about who they were, about what kind of death their brothers deserved, and whether 96 survivors could give them that death's meaning by either avenging them or dying alongside them. When Grimaldus arrived and then left, and then came back with the guard and the plan and the promise of Black Templar reinforcements, he was giving the Lions something specific, a way to have the right kind of death and still survive it, a way to go back to the canyon for their brothers and come out the other side as a chapter that had redeemed its honor rather than simply exhausted itself against an immovable enemy. He was giving them a story with a different ending than the one they had been prepared to accept. The Second Mannheim Siege, the battle that Grimaldus orchestrated with Imperial Guard regiments pulled from Hell's Reach and eventually reinforced by the Black Templars, was not the largest battle on Armageddon. Not even close. By the scale of what Ghazkul's invasion required to resist, a canyon assault with some guard regiments and a handful of space marines was a sideshow. But it was the most important thing that happened to the Celestial Lions, and arguably to the wider question of whether a space marine chapter could be destroyed by the Inquisition for the crime of speaking truth and get away with it. Because the Lions won with almost nothing, reduced to a fragment and fighting alongside human soldiers who were not space marines and would never be space marines. Ikene Dubaku and the last of his brothers went back to the place where the chapter had been broken, and they broke the thing that had broken them. Thogfang's death did not undo the Mannheim Gap massacre, but it reclaimed the narrative. It refused to let the story end, with the Lions as victims of a betrayal they could never answer. They answered. It cost almost everything they had left, but they answered. And then the Black Templars fell from the sky, and for one brief and luminous moment, the canyon that had been the site of the chapter's destruction became the site of something that looked, despite everything, like triumph. Extended. Reading the Lions into the broader 40K landscape. There is one more dimension of the Celestial Lions worth exploring before we close this account, and it is the dimension that makes them most relevant to how you think about the Warhammer 40,000 setting as a whole. The 41st millennium is a setting defined by extremity. Everything is enormous. The threats are existential. The solutions are genocidal. The wars are measured in continents rather than counties, in centuries rather than campaigns. This scale can sometimes make the individual human or superhuman element of the setting feel very small, pressed down under the weight of a universe that is simply too vast and too dark to care about any particular person's story. The Celestial Lions push back against this. Not by ignoring the scale, their history is embedded in wars of exactly this kind, from the Hive World Siege of Armageddon to the Chaos Offensive across 20 worlds in Alara's Veil. But by insisting that within the scale, the individual still matters. The specific name still matters. The story of exactly what happened in exactly that canyon on exactly that day still matters, even if the war goes on around it for years and decades and eventually centuries. This is, at a thematic level, what storytelling always argues, that the particular instance has value, even within the general condition. That you can care about one specific death without being naive about the fact that 10,000 other deaths are happening simultaneously somewhere else. That the insistence on specificity, this name, this face, this moment is not sentimentality, but is in fact the most honest response to a universe that would prefer to process everything in aggregate, and therefore never really feel any of it. The Celestial Lions have built this philosophical position into their culture so deeply that it comes out even in their military behavior. They count their dead, they remember them by name. They know not just how many brothers fell in the Mannheim Gap, but who each of those brothers was, what pride they served in, what stories they had been heard to tell, what specific thing about them will be missed. This is not operationally efficient. It is humanly necessary. And the chapter that maintains it, even in the face of total destruction, is making a statement about what they believe is worth fighting for. You fight for the Imperium? Yes. You fight for the Emperor? Yes. But underneath all of that, the Celestial Lions fight for the specific people who stand beside them, and for the memory of the specific people who used to stand beside them and no longer can. And that motivation, personal, specific, warm, irreplaceable, is what carries a chapter through the kind of losses that, should by rights, have broken it entirely. There is a reason the community has latched onto the Lions so intensely in recent years, particularly following the release of Space Marine 2, which put their distinctive gold and azure armor in front of a huge new audience. Players who encounter the Lions for the first time and then dig into the lore often describe the same experience. They expected another interesting military faction with cool aesthetics, and they found a family that had been almost murdered by the institution that was supposed to protect it, and was still standing, and was still telling the story. That is powerful. That resonates with people. Not because the Warhammer 40,000 setting is usually uplifting, it is emphatically not, but because, in the specific case of the Lions, the darkness of the setting serves to make the warmth of the chapter stand out more clearly by contrast. They are gold in a universe of gray. They are warm in a setting that is defined by cold machinery and cold faith and cold institutional purpose. And they are proof that being warm and being strong are not contradictions, that you can be the most human chapter in the Adeptus Astartes and still be formidable enough that not even the most powerful clandestine organization in the Imperium can fully finish the job of destroying you. The Celestial Lions are the chapter nobody knows. They are also, for the people who do know them, often the chapter they care most about, which is exactly what the Lions would want, I think. Not to be the most famous chapter, not to be the ones everyone knows, just to have their story told truthfully by someone willing to keep telling it even when the telling is hard. That is what we have tried to do here. And if you carry a piece of their story forward from this video, if you mention the Celestial Lions to someone who has never heard of them, if you help one more person find the gold armor and the azure helms, and the culture of hunters who refuse to be silenced, then the Death Speaker's work continues. Tell the story. Tell it true. The Lions would be pleased. If you have made it this far, you are someone who cares deeply about the lore of this setting, and I am incredibly grateful that you spent this time with me. Drop a comment below telling me where you are in the world and what time it is where you are watching. I genuinely love knowing how far these videos reach. If you are new here, and the Lions have moved you the way they have moved so many of us, subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. There is so much more of this universe worth exploring together. The Celestial Lions endure, and so do we. Until next time, Extended, the political architecture of inquisitorial power. One of the things that makes the Celestial Lions story so specifically devastating is that it forces a close look at something the Warhammer 40,000 setting often treats as background scenery. The actual mechanics of how inquisitorial power works in practice, and why a Space Marine chapter, genetically enhanced, heavily armed, with a history of crushing armies, cannot simply refuse to be destroyed by it. The Inquisition is one of the strangest political entities in any science fiction setting. It is simultaneously one of the most powerful organizations in the Imperium and one of the least formally organized. There is no Inquisitor General in the sense of a single supreme commander. There is no inquisitorial high council that makes binding decisions about policy. The Ordos, Xenos, Hereticus, Malleus, and others are not armies with unified command structures, but loose philosophical alignments, schools of thought about what threats to prioritize and how to approach them, within which individual inquisitors operate according to their own judgment. This is by design, and it creates something that functions like distributed power without centralized accountability. Each inquisitor is, within their jurisdiction and according to their rank, essentially sovereign. They can requisition resources from almost any imperial institution. They can overrule planetary governors. They can order the deployment of military assets. And critically, they are immune to legal persecution or investigation by any authority except the Inquisition itself, which means that an inquisitor who abuses their power can only be checked by another inquisitor who disagrees with them, or by the High Lords of Terra, who have their own political concerns and rarely become directly involved in what they consider internal inquisitorial matters. The Celestial Lions ran into this architecture in the worst possible way. Apollyon ordered an exterminatus on Qatar. He claimed it was justified. The Lions complained, loudly and persistently, and the response of the Inquisition as an institution was not to investigate whether Apollyon was right or wrong. It was to be offended that a Space Marine chapter was challenging inquisitorial authority at all. Because once you allow that a Space Marine chapter can successfully petition for an investigation into an Inquisitor's actions and actually get that investigation conducted and potentially get a finding against the Inquisitor, you have established a precedent that makes every Inquisitor more accountable and therefore, in the view of some powerful people within the Inquisition, more constrained. The Inquisition could not afford that precedent. Not because Apollyon was necessarily right, there are probably Inquisitors who privately thought what he did was an overreach, but because the precedent of accountability to the Adeptus Astartes was too dangerous to their institutional power. So, the response was not to engage with the substance of the Lions' complaint. The response was to make the Lions an example. This is, to be completely clear, a description of institutional corruption operating in exactly the way that corruption always operates when power is unchecked. The Inquisition was created to protect humanity from its worst threats. In this case, it became one of those threats, not because every individual within it was evil, but because the structure of the institution rewarded protecting itself over addressing legitimate grievance. Any real-world student of how powerful institutions behave when challenged will recognize every beat of this story. Now, Space Marine chapters are themselves extraordinary military forces. A chapter at full strength is 1,000 of the most capable warriors produced by humanity in 10,000 years of war. Their equipment is among the finest the Imperium can produce. Their training is lifelong and continuous. Their biology has been augmented beyond the recognizable limits of the human form. They are, in short, the kind of military force that wins wars. Why can they not simply refuse to be destroyed? The answer is that military power, however formidable, is only effective against threats that present themselves as military problems. The Inquisition did not send an army to destroy the Celestial Lions. It used access, information, and institutional connections to place the Lions in situations where the military capability of the chapter could be negated. The sabotage at Armageddon did not defeat the Lions in battle. It defeated the conditions that made battle meaningful: the intelligence, the supply lines, the communications, the support systems, the fleet presence that gives a Space Marine chapter its strategic reach. Strip those away while the chapter is committed to a major campaign, and you do not need to beat them in a fight. You just need the fight they are already in to be slightly harder and slightly less supported than it would otherwise be, in enough specific ways for long enough. The Lions could not fight back against what was being done to them on Armageddon, because they could not even prove what was being done. Every incident had a plausible, non-conspiracy explanation: bad warp weather affecting navigation, mechanical failure in the wall guns, orc snipers who happened to be remarkably accurate and happened to be targeting the Lions' senior officers specifically. Any individual incident, looked at in isolation, could be written off. The pattern, looked at in its entirety, was unmistakable. But the Lions did not have the time or the resources or the institutional access to compile the evidence in a form that would have been actionable even if they had known exactly whom to bring it to. And this, perhaps, is the deepest horror of the Celestial Lions situation. They were right. They were loyal. They had done nothing wrong. And none of that protected them, because the force arrayed against them was not operating in a domain where being right provides protection. The Inquisition's power is real and is institutional, and institutions that protect themselves from accountability can operate in ways that individual righteousness simply cannot answer. The fact that the Lions survived at all, that the Black Templars intervened, that Grimaldus understood what was happening and refused to let it be completed, this is not the Imperium working as it should. This is individuals within the Imperium making choices that the system did not require of them and would not have rewarded them for making. Grimaldus did not have to go to Vulcanus. The Eternal Crusader did not have to hold position above Armageddon after the main campaign was won. Helbrecht did not have to rain drop pods into the Mannheim Gap for 96 warriors of another chapter. They chose to do these things because they believed it was right, not because the Imperium structures told them to. This is, quietly, one of the more hopeful elements of the Lion's story, that individual choice still matters. That even in a setting where institutional power can crush almost anything it turns against, people within those institutions and outside them can decide to be the exception. Grimaldus is an exception. Helbrecht is an exception. The Steel Legion officers who marched their regiments out of Hell's Reach because the hero of Hell's Reach asked them to were exceptions. None of them had to do what they did. They did it anyway. The Lions themselves are the original exception in this story. They did not have to say anything after Qatar. They could have processed the atrocity, noted it in their records, and moved on, as many chapters might have done in the same circumstances, choosing pragmatism over principle, choosing survival over truth-telling. They chose not to. They chose to speak, and to keep speaking, and to keep demanding accounting, even when it cost them everything. They were the original refusal to be silenced, and that refusal is what set every subsequent event in motion, including ultimately the intervention that saved them. The Inquisition tried to teach a lesson to the entire Adeptus Astartes through the Celestial Lions. The lesson was meant to be, do not challenge our authority. The lesson that actually emerged, at least for the Black Templars and the Emperor's Spears and others who know the full story, is somewhat different. The Inquisition will destroy you if it can, and the only thing that stands between you and that destruction is the solidarity of your fellow Sons of Dorn and your own stubborn refusal to die quietly. Extended, the irony of gold aesthetic and meaning. There is something that has always struck me about the visual design of the Celestial Lions, and it is worth spending some time with, because in the Warhammer hobby, aesthetics and meaning are almost never separable. Gold is the color of the Emperor in much of the setting's visual language. The golden throne, the golden eagle of the Imperial Aquila, the gilded edges of the Imperial Guard's officer dress uniforms, the gold that decorates the armor of the most senior custodes, those personal bodyguards of the Emperor who are themselves encased in gilded armor that speaks of a divine proximity no other mortal can claim. Gold is sacred. Gold is the color of the institution the Lions serve. And the Lions themselves wear gold. Their entire body of armor, that ceramite shell that is simultaneously a fortress and a workspace and a life support system and a statement of identity, is burnished gold. Not edged with gold, not gilded in decoration. Gold as the base, as the skin, as the visible surface of everything they are. This creates a specific irony when you know the Lion's story. Because the most thoroughly gold chapter in the setting, more gold even than the Custodes, who wear gold in accents over a base of auramite, more purely gold than the Imperial Fists, who carry gold in their color scheme, but not as a primary armor. Color is the chapter that was destroyed by the servants of the Golden Institution. The Lions wore the Emperor's color in its most complete expression, and the Inquisition that claims to serve the Emperor used every tool at its disposal to reduce that gold to ash in the canyons of Armageddon. There is something almost poetically unjust about this when you lay it out. The chapter that most visually embodies Imperial service, in the literal sense of wearing Imperial colors head to foot, is the one that the Imperium's secret police tried to erase. The warriors who look like the Emperor's chosen are the ones who suffered at the hands of people claiming to act in his name. The Celestial Lions in their gold armor are a walking demonstration of the gap between what the Imperium claims to be and what it actually is in practice, between the gold of the ideal and the gray of the reality. Against that gold, the azure of their shoulder plates and helmets provides the contrast that grounds the scheme and makes it striking rather than overwhelming. Azure, a deep, clear blue that reads as sky or water or, in the context of a chapter from a world of savannas and jungles, the color of the world beyond the horizon, the color of distance and possibility. The Lions standing in their gold and blue are simultaneously armored in the most authoritative Imperial color and decorated with something that suggests the specific living world they came from. Their chapter badge, a roaring lion's head in white on a field of azure, is another layer of this. The lion as a symbol carries enormous cultural resonance across dozens of human cultures and traditions, and the Celestial Lions lean into it without apology. A lion's head roaring is aggression and pride and strength. It is the animal that hunts by patience and then strikes with absolute commitment. It is the apex predator of open grasslands, the ruler of the pride, the creature that looks like a sun when it moves through tall grass. For a chapter from a world of savannas, the lion is not just a visual choice, it is the name of their home. The gold armor and the lion badge and the azure helms combine into a chapter visual identity that is, unlike the muted and functional aesthetics of many chapters, genuinely beautiful, warm, almost regal. There is something sun-like about the celestial lions in their armor. They look like warriors from a world that was once warm and golden, even when they are standing in the gray ash of Armageddon or the cold void of an orbital engagement. They carry their world with them in the colors they wear, and those colors refuse to be dimmed by whatever environment they find themselves in. This visual warmth is absolutely appropriate to who the lions are, and it makes the imagery of their near-destruction gold armor heaped in the canyon, the roaring lion badges face down in the blood and mud of the Mannheim Gap, the burnished surfaces of their armor catching the last light as the bodies are defiled by the greenskins who had been used as the weapon of their destruction, that much more affecting. The visual that should represent warmth and pride and the beauty of their homeworld becomes an image of loss. And then, at the second Mannheim siege, when the survivors go back in their battered and scarred gold armor to reclaim what was taken, the color starts to mean something new. Not the gold of the untouched ideal, but the gold of what endures after the worst has been done to it. Damaged and rebuilt and fighting forward, still warm despite everything. Extended. What comes next? Open questions and future lore. As of the most recent published lore, the Celestial Lions occupy a genuinely uncertain position, and that uncertainty is part of what makes them such a compelling subject for speculation and ongoing community interest. Ekene Dubaku is dead. The chapter master who rebuilt the lions from 96 warriors, who trained a new generation, who presided over the recovery of everything that should not have been recoverable, he was assassinated by a Calidus disguised as someone who had no reason to harm him in a meeting that was supposed to be about saving his people. He is gone, and the account of his death in the novel that covers these events is one of the most genuinely shocking moments in the recent Black Library output, because by the time you reach it, you have come to believe in Dubaku's survival in a way that the setting rarely earns for its characters. His successor is unnamed in the current published material, as far as I have been able to verify. The chapter continues, but under leadership we have not yet been introduced to in detail. This is a gap in the lore that presumably will be filled at some point, possibly through new Black Library fiction or new codex supplements or game releases. Whoever leads the Lions now has inherited a terrible situation. A chapter that has been reduced and partially rebuilt twice, a homeworld that has been lost to chaos forces, an ongoing war in Alara's Vale that is being slowly lost, and a vendetta from an inquisitorial faction that has already demonstrated it can reach the chapter master in a secured meeting with allied chapters. The Fourth War for Armageddon is also referenced in the most recent records, with the Celestial Lions committing one company, 2 Nova-class frigates, and a strike cruiser as part of something called Operation Imperator. This tells us a few interesting things. First, that the chapter has recovered enough to project military force beyond Alara's Vale, suggesting the rebuilding process did eventually bear fruit. Second, that the chapter's particular hatred of the greenskins born in the Mannheim Gap is enough to make them commit resources to Armageddon, even when they are already stretched defending the Vale. Third, that the chapter maintains operational capability in the Era Indomitus, even while fighting a major chaos offensive on their home turf. The relationship between the Lions and the Black Templars, established in such dramatic circumstances at Armageddon, continues to evolve in interesting ways. The Black Templars are one of the most numerous chapters in the Imperium. They never split into more chapters after their founding, instead growing their numbers far beyond the nominal codex limit of 1,000, with some estimates placing them at several times that number, and they maintain their centuries-long connection to the Lions as a matter of Dornian brotherhood. In the current era, with the Lions facing ongoing inquisitorial pressure and existential threats in the Vale, the question of what the Black Templars will do if the Inquisition makes another direct move against their cousins is one that hangs over the setting in interesting ways. The Emperor's spears, similarly, have now directly witnessed the Inquisition's vendetta against the Lions. They were present when Dubaku was assassinated on their own vessel. Arucadas, their chapter master, knows exactly what happened and who was responsible in the broad strokes, even if the specifics remain opaque. A chapter that sees its allied chapter master killed while meeting with it for legitimate military planning purposes is a chapter with a grievance that goes beyond politics. The Emperor's spears were already deeply invested in the defense of the Vale alongside the Lions. Dubaku's assassination on their ship was an act that dishonored them as much as it destroyed a leader of the Lions. And then there is Guilliman. Robut Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who has returned to lead the Imperium's reformation in the era Indomitus, and who has absolutely zero patience for the kind of institutional waste that the Lions story represents. Guilliman is aware of most things that happen within the Imperium's military sphere. He is an extraordinarily capable administrator, as well as a warrior, and the surviving sons of the Primarchs are exactly the kind of resource he tries to preserve and deploy effectively. The idea that the Celestial Lion's story has not reached him strains credibility. Whether he has taken action, what form that action might take, and how the Inquisition responds to a Primarch who decides to involve himself in the accountability question. These are all threads that the narrative has been carefully laying in place without yet pulling. In the community, many readers expect that at some point the vendetta against the Lions will have to be confronted in the lore in a more definitive way. The setup is too careful and too consistent across multiple books to be accidental. The chickens that have been roosting since Qatar are going to come home eventually, and when they do, the Inquisition is going to face a situation that Apollyon and his successors did not entirely plan for. A chapter that survived, that has powerful friends, and that has been telling the story clearly and specifically this entire time, building a record that cannot be buried. What form that reckoning takes, whether it is legal and political reform, or direct conflict between the Lions and whatever inquisitorial faction is still pursuing them, or something more subtle and institutional, is a story that we may not see written for years, or that we may see arrive in the next Black Library release. But it is coming. The narrative logic of the Lion's story demands it, and Aaron Dembski-Bowden, who set this story in motion and has returned to it multiple times, is not the kind of author who leaves threads this carefully constructed, permanently unresolved. The Lions will have their accounting, or the setting will deny it, and in doing so, say something even darker about the nature of the Imperium and whether justice is possible within it. Either choice is dramatically valid, and either choice is interesting. That is, ultimately, what makes the Celestial Lions so endlessly worth talking about.